Arthur Morgan, Dutch van der Linde, and the gang ride through blinding snow and choking dust, dark silhouettes against a dying horizon. It feels in the truest sense like the final march of an old America, a story of freedom on horseback being hunted down by trains, telegraphs, and men in suits. But beneath that perfect image, a quiet question lingers. How much of this America ever truly existed in 1899? From the very beginning, Red Dead Redemption 2 presents itself as the living embodiment of a lost world, where loyalty and betrayal, dreams and delusions, family and violence collide under a blood-red sky. The game captures the emotional truth of the West with almost painful precision. The sense that the world was changing, the certainty that the old ways were dying. Yet to achieve that feeling, Rockstar bends time, compresses decades, and rearranges history until one doomed gang rides through nearly 40 years of American transformation. On paper, the story runs from 1899 to 1907, the final, fading years of the frontier. In practice, the van der Linde saga drags in echoes from the 1870s, conflicts from the 1880s, and social movements that did not peak until the 1910s, then lays them all across a single, continuous trail. Semi-automatic pistols that were rare even in big cities sit casually on bar counters. Pinkerton agents who, in reality, spent more time breaking strikes than chasing small-time outlaws become relentless, almost mythical hunters. Suffragettes march and protest with a confidence and visibility closer to the final push toward the vote than the hesitant agitation of 1899. This is not clumsy error, it is deliberate construction. The gang becomes a microcosm of the American frontier myth, romantic outlaws resisting a corrupt civilization, clinging to a philosophy of freedom as railroads carve up the land and cities like Saint Denis glow with electric light. Yet real outlaw bands were smaller, poorer, and far less idealistic. Real Pinkertons kept ledgers, not legendary vendettas. Real towns were less theatrical, more ordinary, and often more tightly bound to the expanding web of rail lines and telegraph wires that made vanishing into the wilderness almost impossible. So what happens when a game that feels more authentic than most Western films quietly pulls weapons, politics, and social revolutions out of their proper years? What does it mean that Arthur Morgan can rob a bank that looks like the 1870s, flee on trains that feel like the 1880s, dodge lawmen organized like the 1890s, and listen to activists speaking with the language of the 1910s, all within a single lifetime? This is not a list of tiny mistakes. This is a story of a beautiful lie, a tragic America that never was, assembled from scattered decades and polished until it gleams. In this video, the gang's world will be taken apart chronologically, from its humble beginnings to its bloody end. The guns, the trains, the Pinkertons, the suffragettes, the telegraphs, every borrowed year, every compressed moment, every historical fracture in the legend of Dutch van der Linde. To pull that legend apart, the promise is simple and absolute. This will be a story of the van der Linde gang from the very beginning to the very end, walked step by step against the real America of 1899 to 1907. From Dutch and Hosea's first schemes to the last desperate shots on a snowy ridge, every campfire tale and every famous robbery will be held up beside the world that actually existed. That means following the gang's life in phases. Founding, expansion, decay, collapse, each stage of their journey will be paired with the history it quietly distorts. When Dutch and Hosea talk about being the last true outlaws, their words will be measured against the fading outlaw era, when the old ways were dying years before Arthur Morgan ever drew a gun. When Pinkertons ride in as relentless boogeymen, their pursuit will be compared to what real private detectives and marshals actually did, and who they really hunted. Technology will form another spine through this tale. The game scatters semi-automatic pistols, scoped rifles, and near-mythic firepower across a frontier that, in reality, saw such weapons rarely and unevenly. Telegraph wires and railroads had already webbed across the continent by 1899, making many of the gang's great escapes almost impossible. So each heist, each daring train job or bank robbery will be set against authentic vault designs, response times, and the reach of law in a rapidly tightening civilization. Race and gender will be traced just as closely. Characters such as Charles and Sadie move through a world that presents itself as brutally honest about prejudice, yet compresses decades of social change into a few crowded years. Suffrage marches in Saint Denis echo protests that truly roared in the 1910s, while the supposed freedom of the frontier collides with Jim Crow realities and reservation policies that the game only brushes. How much of their struggle reflects 1899, and how much belongs to a later, louder America? Through it all, the method remains clear. This is not an attack on the game's quality, but a separation of cinematic West from historical West. Rockstar's world is the living embodiment of a century of Western movies and dime novels, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, crafted to feel true even when it is not. Each choice will be examined, where drama overrides accuracy, why it works, and why it lingers. Structurally, the path will stay chronological, but the lens will keep shifting. A camp move becomes a chance to zoom out to rail maps. A Pinkerton raid opens onto real corporate wars. A visit to St. Denis invites comparison to New Orleans, its electric lights and streetcars grounded in fact, its crime and corruption heightened into operatic myth. Again and again, Dutch's philosophy will be set against the timeline that quietly contradicts him. All of it begins before Arthur's journal, before John's scars, before Blackwater's ferry. At a lonely crossroads in the 1870s, two con men reach for each other's wallets, and in that attempted double robbery, history is already bending into legend. The story begins not with gunfire, but with a punchline. Two men, two revolvers, one unlucky coach, and a realization hanging in the air thicker than gunsmoke. They are both trying to rob the same target. In the legend told around campfires, Dutch van der Linde steps out with that preacher's cadence and outlaw swagger, ready to liberate some ill-gotten gains from the wealthy. Hosea Matthews appears from the shadows with the same intention, the same confidence, and almost the same rehearsed threat. For a heartbeat, it is a standoff. Fingers tighten on triggers, eyes narrow, and this could be a story of blood on the road and two careers ending before they begin. Instead, the coachman faints, the passengers scream, and Dutch and Hosea slowly realize they have rehearsed the same robbery on the same day. One of them laughs first, the other follows. The guns lower, the tension breaks, and the scene turns from near duel to shared joke. In that moment, the game offers a story of instant recognition, two clever men who see themselves reflected in each other, who choose partnership over pride, and who walk away not as rivals, but as the foundation of a new outlaw family. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang is framed as a meeting of minds, almost a romantic comedy of crime. But this is myth, not police report. In the real late 19th century West, most criminals were not charismatic philosopher thieves trading witty barbs at lonely crossroads. They were ranch hands paid late, drifters pushed off the railroad payroll, local toughs who drank too much and made desperate choices. Robberies were usually messy, opportunistic, and mean, committed by men who vanished back into mining towns and rail camps, not the living embodiment of some grand political philosophy. By the 1890s, the world was changing faster than Dutch's story admits. The telegraph stitched towns together in minutes, railroads tied territories into a single economic web, and professional law enforcement, from marshals to corporate detectives, made long-running, multi-state gangs increasingly difficult to sustain. The classic outlaw bands that haunted earlier decades, the James Younger Gang, the Daltons, had already been shattered by botched robberies and rapid communication. The old ways were dying, even as Dutch claims to be defending them. Red Dead Redemption 2 leans into dim novel storytelling in the truest sense. Dutch and Hosea's meet-cute feels pulled straight from an 1870s pulp, charming rogues, elaborate schemes, comedic mishaps that end in loyalty rather than prison. The game borrows the tone of exaggerated frontier tales, where a single holdup becomes a story of destiny and brotherhood, rather than the small, brutal entry in a sheriff's ledger it would have been in 1899. And even here, at the very beginning, the timeline is already bending. Dutch imagines himself resisting a frontier civilization that has mostly vanished, chasing dreams that belonged to his parents' generation. The question is not just how long he can outrun the law, but how long he can outrun history itself, and the next chapter shows what happens when that delusion meets a world that refuses to stand still. By 1899, Dutch is already a man out of time. The tragedy is that the game lets him speak as if history is happening to him in the present, when in reality, the world he mourns had mostly vanished before Arthur Morgan was even grown. The classic frontier era, the one filled with dime novels and campfire legends, belongs to the 1860s through the 1880s. The great cattle drives that pushed herds up the Chisholm Trail, the days when towns sprang up overnight around railheads, the famous gunfights that turned men into myths. Those are the years of Wild Bill Hickok in Abilene, of Billy the Kid in New Mexico, of Jesse James robbing banks and trains in the wake of the Civil War. That is the very beginning of the outlaw legend Dutch worships, a story of freedom and defiance before barbed wire and bureaucracy closed in. By contrast, 1899 is the epilogue. The U.S. Census Bureau had already declared the frontier closed in 1890, announcing that there was no longer a clear line where settled land ended and wilderness began. Railroads laced the continent together. Telegraph lines carried news faster than any rider. Barbed wire carved open range into private property, turning roaming cowhands into wage workers or vagrants. When Dutch rages that civilization is stealing the West from him, he is, in the truest sense, mourning a theft that happened a decade earlier. The world was changing in ways the gang barely understands. St. Denis glows with electric lights and industrial smoke. Streetcars rattle past suffragettes and factory hands. Even small towns in the heartlands have regular trains, telegraph offices, and lawmen who can wire Pinkertons in hours. Dutch's speeches about encroaching civilization sound as if they were written for the 1870s, then dropped into a world already on the verge of automobiles and motion pictures. Is he fighting civilization, or is he simply refusing to admit that civilization has already won? Rockstar takes the slow, uneven death of the frontier and compresses it into a single dramatic squeeze. What unfolded over 30 years, cattle towns rising and falling, railroads consolidating power, homesteaders fencing off land, outlaws aging into relics, becomes, for Dutch, a few desperate seasons. From its humble beginnings as a loose band of thieves to its final days in the swamps and mountains, the gang is forced to experience in a handful of winters what America processed over a generation. The Van der Linde camp becomes the living embodiment of a whole era dying on fast forward. That compression is powerful, but it has a cost. If Dutch is already living in a half-imagined past, chasing dreams that belong to Hickok and Jesse rather than Arthur and John, what does that say about the philosophy he preaches? What happens to a family built on ideals that were never truly real to begin with? The next steps in their story will show how that delusion twists every choice, every betrayal, and every attempt at freedom that follows. Dutch's answer to that unreality is simple, seductive, and wrong. In his own mind, he is the last true believer in freedom. Government is corrupt, the rich own everything, and only an outlaw family bound by loyalty can live beyond the reach of a rotten civilization. The gang is not just a crew of thieves. In the truest sense, Dutch insists it is a refuge, a philosophy, a story of people refusing to bow. He preaches that banks, railroads, and the state are all the same machine, grinding down the poor and the different. He tells Arthur, John, and the others that they are the living embodiment of resistance, stealing from the powerful, protecting the weak, and holding on to an older, purer world. Around the campfire, his words sound almost holy, a gospel of freedom and family delivered with a preacher's cadence and a conman's timing. But in real 1899 America, the biggest battles were not framed as poetic struggles between freedom and civilization in the abstract. The world was changing in very specific ways. Industrialization was swallowing cities. Rail networks and telegraphs were binding regions together, and the fiercest conflicts raged over labor rights, corporate monopolies, and the power of trusts. Pinkertons in that era were known less for chasing romantic outlaws and more for breaking strikes, guarding factories, and defending industrial capital. Dutch occasionally brushes against that reality. He rails against railroads and oil barons, gestures at St. Denis as a den of robber barons and crooked politicians, and mutters about monopolies and the government being bought. Yet his language is strangely timeless, almost disconnected from the concrete politics of 1899. He never speaks the language of farmers' alliances, of populists, of unions crushed by the very detectives hired to hunt him. His philosophy floats above his own time, grand but vague. That is because Dutch talks like a man assembled from several eras at once. Part of him is an 1870s frontier outlaw, dreaming of endless space and loose law, quoting dime novels in everything but name. Another part speaks with the cadence of early 20th century revolutionaries, promising that the people will rise, that the system will fall, that history itself is on his side. He borrows the posture of a Robin Hood, the fury of a labor agitator, and the nostalgia of a drifting gunman, without ever belonging fully to any of them. Beneath that patchwork creed lies a quieter truth. His gospel is built on hypocrisy. Dutch condemns exploitation while exploiting his own family, sending Arthur bleeding into impossible situations, using John's absence to guilt him, and demanding loyalty from women and children he drags from one war zone to another. He claims to protect the weak, then forces the gang's most vulnerable members to live under constant threat, promising safety he can no longer deliver. As technology and law tighten around them, that hypocrisy will only grow sharper. Telegraph lines, rail schedules, and coordinated law enforcement make the gang's raids less rebellion and more suicide. Yet Dutch refuses to accept that the old ways were dying long before Blackwater. His philosophy shifts from resisting a real system to justifying his own refusal to change, turning every failure into betrayal, every warning into treason. The next chapters in this story will show how that delusion poisons the camp from within, and how a gospel of freedom becomes a cage no one can escape. Dutch treats history as a sermon. Hosea treats it as a ledger. From the very beginning of the gang's story, he is the man quietly doing the math while Dutch delivers the speeches. The con man who actually understands how the world works, and how it is about to stop working for men like them. Hosea is an outlaw in the truest sense, but his weapon of choice is not the revolver, it is the lie. He prefers the hotel scam in Valentine, the art auction trick in Saint Denis, the fake moonshine deal with Lemoyne Raiders. Small grifts, quick exits, no grandstanding. While Dutch dreams of one last glorious score, Hosea dreams of a quiet cabin, a fishing trip. A world where survival depends on reading people, not outdrawing them. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, he is the living embodiment of hard-earned skepticism. That preference for grifts over gunfights is not just personality, it is history. By 1899, the classic image of the Wild West outlaw robbing stagecoaches in broad daylight was already fading. The world was changing. Railroads webbed the continent, banks hardened their vaults, and telegraph wires could turn a single gunshot into a wanted poster 3 states away. Real criminals were shifting toward fraud, confidence tricks, and urban rackets, because open banditry had become a fast road to an unmarked grave. Hosea understands this. He watches Saint Denis with a con man's eye, electric lights, streetcars, newspapers, Pinkerton stepping off modern trains. He knows that in a wired railroad-linked America, a gang that blows up safes and shoots its way out of town will not vanish into the wilderness. Its description will be humming down telegraph lines before the smoke clears. More than once he tells Dutch that the days of big, flashy robberies are over. More than once Dutch refuses to listen. In this, Hosea is closer to the real 1899 than the game around him. He knows that the old ways were dying, that the frontier myth Dutch sells to the camp is already a relic. When he pushes for cons over carnage, for slipping through civilization instead of declaring war on it, he is voicing the sober truth that most gangs of the era either adapted into quieter crime or disappeared under the combined weight of law, technology, and corporate money. Yet the story does something cruel and deliberate. It sidelines him. Hosea's historically grounded skepticism is drowned out as Dutch doubles down on a fantasy version of outlaw glory, planning robberies that would have been almost impossible to outrun in a nation of rail schedules and telegraph keys. The gang chooses the legend over the ledger, the sermon over the warning. And when the one man who can still read the changing world is taken off the board, what happens to a family built on a philosophy that no longer exists outside Dutch's mind? From the very beginning, Dutch does not just build a gang, he builds a camp that looks, on the surface, like a small, wandering utopia. Men and women, black and white, native and immigrant, sharpshooters and swindlers, children and elders, all gathered around the same fire, sharing coffee, stories, and stolen money under a banner of freedom and mutual support. It feels less like a posse and more like a traveling village, the living embodiment of Dutch's claim that civilization has failed its most vulnerable. In this world, a former slave like Lenny can sit beside an ex, buffalo soldier like Charles, while a widow-turned avenger like Sadie shares space with a German family and a mixed-race kid who idolizes Arthur. The camp is a story of parallel lives, of people who would never share a table in 1899 America suddenly treated, in the truest sense, as one family. Chores are divided, voices are heard, and even the poker table becomes a place where class, race, and gender seem to blur under the soft light of the lanterns. Historically, that image is powerful. It is also almost entirely a dream. Most real outlaw gangs of the late 19th century were smaller, tighter, and far more homogeneous, built around blood ties, shared hometowns, or a single ethnic community. The James Younger Gang, the Daltons, the Wild Bunch, these were clusters of brothers and cousins, childhood friends, and local toughs, not broad coalitions of every marginalized group pushed to the edge of the map. A black gunman riding with a white Southern gang, a native tracker treated as an equal, a woman given a rifle and a vote? That would have been the exception, not the rule. The way the Van der Linde camp actually operates pushes the fantasy even further. Dutch calls meetings, listens to grievances, and turns robberies into open debates about philosophy, freedom, and the fate of the West. Arthur challenges him. Hosea tempers him. Even Javier and Charles argue over tactics and ideals in front of the whole camp. It feels strangely modern, closer to a 20th century revolutionary cell than to the brutal, top-down structures that defined most 19th century criminal groups, where a leader's word was law and dissent could be answered with a shallow grave. Here, the pattern interrupts history itself. In a period when the world was changing, but the old ways were dying hard, the gang behaves as if chosen family, inclusive community, and semi-democratic decision-making are already accepted truths. The game leans into this utopian framing to make the gang emotionally irresistible, turning every shared song, every rescued child, every defended camp into proof that this outlaw family deserves to survive. Yet those are modern dreams projected backward onto 1899, a philosophy of belonging that would only become common decades later. That tension is deliberate. The more Dutch's family looks like a modern fantasy, the more brutal it will feel when both history and the story close in. What happens when a dream of freedom meets the cold arithmetic of railroads, telegraphs, and Pinkertons? The answer is coming, and it will tear this fragile experiment apart from the inside. That collision is not just technological or political, it is moral. Dutch insists from the very beginning that his gang is different, that this is not a story of common cutthroats but of principled rebels holding the line against a corrupt civilization. He repeats the same rules until they sound almost sacred: no needless killing, protect women and children, steal from the rich and the wicked, never from the poor and honest. Around the campfire, that philosophy feels almost noble, the living embodiment of an outlaw code that promises freedom without cruelty and crime without shame. Then the sun comes up, the guns come out, and the world quietly refuses to cooperate. Because the game allows those rules to be broken constantly. Innocent townsfolk can be robbed in back alleys, trains full of working families can be looted, witnesses can be silenced with a bullet rather than a warning. The honor meter ticks up and down. But the sheer range of cinematic violence on offer would have made any real 1899 gang famous for all the wrong reasons, and very quickly dead. Historically, some outlaws did try to cultivate that Robin Hood glow. Jesse James had newspaper allies, regional loyalties, and a post-war grievance to sell. But most bandits on the late frontier were driven by survival and opportunity, not idealistic rhetoric. They robbed whoever was vulnerable, small-town banks with minimal security, isolated ranches, stagecoaches where a terrified clerk guarded a strongbox. In the truest sense, the targets were chosen by risk, not by moral calculus. Red Dead Redemption 2 reshapes that messy reality by stocking the world with convenient villains. Corrupt sheriffs take bribes in back rooms, industrialists in St. Denis crush unions with hired guns, and racist townsfolk spit venom in the streets. Every time the gang draws steel, there is almost always some caricature of abuse nearby, as if the universe itself were begging for Dutch's brand of justice. Yet, real small-town power in 1899 was less theatrical and more entangled. Local merchants extended credit, sheriffs knew every family by name, and even the worst men depended on a fragile peace to keep business running. That framing serves a purpose. It lets the gang feel like a persecuted family rather than a roaming band of predators. And it lets the player move through a world of escalating robberies, massacres, and full-scale assaults while still clinging to the illusion of being on the right side. But the old ways were dying, and gangs that staged repeated, spectacular heists against railroads and city banks did not survive for long years of campfire philosophizing. Into that contradiction steps Arthur Morgan. From its humble beginnings, his arc is meant to answer a single question: can Dutch's flexible code actually save a lost soul? Or is it just another story a desperate man tells himself while the world is changing without him? Arthur's answer to that question begins long before 1899. It begins with a boy watching the gallows. From the very beginning, Arthur Morgan's life is a story of absence and improvisation. His father, Lyle Morgan, is a petty criminal who spends more time in saloons and jail cells than at home, until the law finally does what it always promised to do: it hangs him, or buries him in a prison yard where names do not matter. Arthur's mother dies young. The result is a child drifting between relatives, odd jobs, and petty theft, already learning that in this world, freedom comes in stolen moments between arrests. His early brushes with the law are not grand robberies, but small, desperate acts. A stolen watch, a threatened storekeeper, a boy playing at outlaw before civilization has even decided what to call him. When Dutch and Hosea find him, they do not stumble onto a prodigy. They find a half-starved teenager trying to rob the wrong man, and discovering with a certain grim irony that the victim is an even better thief. From its humble beginnings, this encounter becomes the hinge of Arthur's entire life. Dutch sees potential, a recruit who can be molded into his philosophy. Hosea sees a lost soul who will not survive another winter alone. Together they adopt him in the truest sense, not through law or blood, but through shared crimes, shared fires, and a shared belief that the world is rigged against people like them. The Van der Linde gang becomes his family, his school, his church. Historically, fragments of this story ring true. Many real outlaws came from poverty, broken homes, alcoholic fathers, and violent towns where the sheriff was just another man with a gun. But the idea of a charismatic gang raising a boy into a lifelong professional outlaw, grooming him across decades, belongs more to myth than to the record. Most frontier criminals drifted in and out of gangs, died young, or simply disappeared. Few enjoyed a stable, almost domestic criminal apprenticeship. Arthur's inner life stretches things even further. He reads, he thinks, he questions. His journal is the living embodiment of a 20th century antihero dropped into the 19th century. Detailed sketches, moral reflections, doubts about Dutch's dreams and delusions. In reality, the average hired gun left almost nothing behind but court reports and newspaper clippings, not pages of introspective handwriting debating freedom and betrayal. Through this, Rockstar compresses decades of American change into one man. Arthur remembers the older, wilder West Dutch talks about, when the railroads were thinner and the telegraph less suffocating. Yet he is still young enough to ride past automobiles, electric street lamps, and cities that feel more 1910 than 1899. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, and Arthur is forced to straddle both. That makes him a perfect narrative bridge, but a historical stretch. A single outlaw whose life conveniently intersects almost every remaining Western trope. And as the story follows him from mountain snow to industrial smoke, the gap between his romantic legend and the harsher historical record only grows wider. That tension inside Arthur is not abstract. It has faces, voices, and very different kinds of love. From the very beginning, his world is shaped by two fathers who pull him toward two Americas, two Wests, two competing versions of what freedom is supposed to mean. Dutch fills Arthur's head with ideas. Around the campfire, on long rides, in the quiet after a robbery, Dutch spins a story of the West as it ought to be. A place where an outlaw can stand proud, where loyalty is everything, where a man has the right to live outside civilization and answer only to his own philosophy. His words are grand, theatrical, almost musical. To a boy who lost his blood family early, they sound in the truest sense like scripture. Hosea, by contrast, fills Arthur's hands. He teaches him to track game through fresh snow, to read the nervous glance of a Mark and Valentine, to walk away from a fight that will cost more than it pays. Where Dutch promises, Hosea prepares. Dutch says the world is rigged. Hosea quietly shows how to move through that world without dying in a ditch. Together, they create a powerful illusion. Dutch is the living embodiment of the Diamondoval West, a man whose speeches can change lives and whose gang, at least in the story he tells, can hold back the tide of history through sheer will. Hosea is the reminder that bullets run out, horses founder, and hunger does not care about ideals. One sells the dream, the other sells the map. In that split, the game mirrors the split between myth and history. Dutch represents the romantic frontier that had already been packaged and sold by 1899. Noble outlaws, clean moral lines, one last ride before the curtain falls. Hosea represents the ledger book, the train timetable, the cold reality that the world was changing and the old ways were dying under rail networks and Pinkerton files. Arthur stands between them, and his loyalty leans toward the dreamer. That is what makes the game's historical stretch feel so emotionally sharp. Through Arthur, the audience experiences the clash between legend and fact from the perspective of someone who desperately wants the legend to be true. When Dutch claims one gang can defy an entire civilization, Arthur believes it, even as St. Denis' electric lights and factory smoke say otherwise. Historically, a man Arthur's age in 1899 would be more likely to end up in wage labor, ranch work, or urban crime than in a roving, multi-state outlaw family led by a philosopher king. The era of roaming bands of gunfighters was mostly over. The era of company scrip, 10-hour shifts, and crowded tenements had begun. Yet Arthur is allowed to live inside a story of an older West that should already be fading into memory. The longer he rides, the thinner that story becomes. Each new rail line, each telegraph wire, each Pinkerton raid makes Dutch's sermons about a free frontier sound more like delusions than destiny. How long can Arthur cling to a dying dream, once the modern world finally hits back? The answer will arrive with a city, a bank, and a noose tightening around the gang's throat. That noose does not arrive alone. It rides in with another reminder that the world was changing, not just for Arthur, but for the gang's other son, John Marston. From the very beginning, John's story is harsher, closer to the historical ground than Arthur's almost mythic rescue. Born to a Scottish immigrant who died of drink and disease, John is left in the hands of strangers and institutions that cared more for cheap labor than for children. He is sent to orphanages and reform schools, beaten, worked, and punished until running away seems less dangerous than staying. He steals to survive, fights for scraps, and nearly starves in the margins of civilization. Before Dutch finds him, he is in the truest sense a lost soul. Those institutions, cold dormitories, overseers with switches, endless menial work, fit the real late 19th century more closely than Dutch's romantic speeches admit. Across America, so-called charitable homes and industrial schools turned abandoned children into a disposable workforce. John's background of abuse and forced labor is not an outlaw legend. It is a story of how the old ways were dying for the poor, long before the railroads reached the last frontier. When Dutch and Hosea pull John in, the pattern repeats, but with a different flavor. Dutch tells John the same story he once told Arthur, that the gang is family, that together they will live free, that their crimes are a rebellion against a rigged world. Arthur, found younger and tutored from his humble beginnings, leans into that philosophy with almost religious loyalty. John, older, half-grown, and already betrayed by every adult authority he has known, hears the promise and notices the price tag. He understands that Dutch's rescue comes with strings: protection in exchange for obedience, affection in exchange for service, freedom in exchange for never truly leaving. Where Arthur becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's ideals, John stands at the edge of the campfire, listening, participating, but never entirely convinced. Is this really a family, or just another institution dressed up as one? That skepticism often tracks closer to historical reality than Dutch's rhetoric. John doubts the grand plans, questions the fantasy of one last score, senses that a gang of aging outlaws cannot outrun telegraphs, railroads, and state power forever. His quiet dream of a small ranch, of Abigail and Jack, and a patch of land, mirrors what many former drifters and hired guns actually tried to do as civilization closed in: trade gun smoke for fence posts. Over time, this creates a slow, painful tension at the heart of the gang. Arthur is the believer losing faith, watching Dutch's sermons curdle into delusions and betrayal. John is the doubter discovering, almost against his will, that he still wants some of what Dutch promised: dignity, belonging, a future not dictated by rich men in distant cities. Both men are trapped between freedom and civilization, between dreams and the hard facts of 1899. And when the gang's flight carries them into a modern city built on electricity and banks, that tension will finally be forced to a breaking point. That breaking point is written most clearly in the quiet war between Dutch's two sons. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang is presented as a family, But Arthur and John are the proof that this family is also a battlefield, a story of competing futures hidden inside the same campfire glow. From the very beginning of 1899, their dynamic is edged with rivalry and old resentment. Arthur is the dutiful enforcer, the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, riding out in the snow at Coulter, hunting, collecting debts, doing the grim work that keeps the dream alive. John, half frozen and half dead when he stumbles back from the storm, carries scars from wolves and from earlier betrayals. He disappeared for months, abandoned Abigail and Jack, and left Arthur to pick up the pieces. Dutch forgives him. Arthur does not. Their conversations are loaded with barbed comments, small jabs over who Dutch trusts more, who really understands what the gang is supposed to be. On the surface, they argue about loyalty. Underneath, they argue about time. Arthur defends the roaming outlaw life as if it were a moral stance in the truest sense. Keep moving, keep robbing, keep one step ahead of civilization and its laws. To him, the gang's freedom on horseback is proof that Dutch's words still mean something. John pushes back, sometimes with open defiance, sometimes by simply vanishing when Dutch needs him most. He keeps returning to the same blunt idea: a man cannot outrun the world forever. Sooner or later, he needs land, work, and family, or he dies in a ditch for someone else's dream. Historically, John is closer to the world that actually existed beyond the game's borders. By 1900, the classic Wild West outlaw was already a dying breed. The old ways were dying under railroads, telegraphs, and barbed wire. Former cowboys and drifters were settling as small ranchers, railroad hands, or city laborers, trading the saddle for factory whistles and time clocks. The open range that Dutch promises is already fenced off, sold, and surveyed. John's fantasy is not glamorous, but it is possible. Arthur's is already a ghost. Rockstar uses this clash to keep the audience emotionally anchored to both men, but also to smuggle in a critique of Dutch's delusions. Every time Arthur backs another doomed plan, and John mutters that they should walk away, the game is staging a debate between myth and history, between the story Dutch tells and the world as it really is. John is the first to try to live in that real world, to imagine a small ranch instead of a grand revolution, a family instead of a crusade. The pattern is subtle at first: a snide remark at Horseshoe Overlook, a bitter argument at Shady Bell, a fistfight at Beaver Hollow. But as the gang grows and the modern world presses in, that private argument becomes the central question of the entire saga. Can any outlaw truly survive the 20th century? Or is every ride just leading toward a grave and a railway line? That question stops being abstract the moment Dutch's family stops being a gang and starts becoming a moving town. What began as a handful of riders bound by loyalty and shared dreams slowly swells into something far more unwieldy and far less realistic for the dying days of the frontier. By the time the story reaches Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, the roster is no longer just gun hands and drifters. There are sharpshooters like Charles and Sadie, bomb makers and self-styled experts in improvised distractions like Bill and Micah, swindlers such as Javier and Trelawney, cooks and quartermasters in Pearson and Grimshaw, kids in Jack and the Marston family, and a ring of partners, lovers, and Hangerson orbiting Dutch's charisma. In the truest sense, the camp has become a small, mobile village, the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy that an outlaw can build a new civilization on the run. Historically, that is where the fantasy quietly breaks. Real outlaw bands in the 1870s and 1880s were usually small, temporary, and intensely local. The James Younger Gang, the Daltons, Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, even the famous names rarely kept more than a dozen committed riders together for long, and their raids tended to circle familiar counties rather than roam entire regions. A mixed-skill caravan of 30 or 40 people, drifting across multiple territories for nearly a decade, would not have been a romantic mystery. It would have been a rolling headline. The logistics alone strain belief. Feeding dozens of mouths every day, maintaining horses, wagons, ammunition, and medical care, all while constantly moving camps, would have demanded a steady stream of cash and supplies that far exceeds a few banks, trains, and stagecoaches. By 1899, the world was changing. Railroads spiderwebbed the continent, telegraphs stitched towns together, and lawmen shared information faster than any horse could outrun. A raid in one state could be reported to marshals and railroad detectives in the next before the gang even reached the county line. Could a group this visible really drift from Coulter to Saint Denis without becoming the most hunted organization in the country? The game hints at those pressures with rising bounties and Pinkertons on the trail, but it smooths over the constant desertions, arrests, and betrayals that would have shredded such a community in reality. In history, informants ended more gangs than gunfights. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the Van der Linde camp becomes an outlaw commune that somehow maintains loyalty, secrecy, and mobility for years, even as civilization closes in on every side. That choice serves the story. It turns camp into a story of family from its humble beginnings, a breathing stage where every argument, song, and whispered doubt can be heard. Yet it also creates an impossible legend, a band too big to hide in an era when the old ways were dying under steel rails and electric light. And soon, that legend will be tested. Trains, banks, and the Pinkertons themselves are about to step fully into the narrative, and with each collision between Dutch's roaming village and the machinery of modern law, another crack opens in the myth of the last great outlaw gang. The next move they make will show just how fragile that myth really is. The legend says a train job is simple: a dark stretch of track, a lantern signal, a whistle screaming into the night, and then the Van der Linde gang swarming the cars like ghosts, stripping bonds and jewelry at gunpoint before vanishing into the trees. In the world of Red Dead Redemption 2, it feels clean, cinematic, almost elegant. In the truest sense, it is the fantasy of the West running on steel rails. From its humble beginnings, the classic Van der Linde train robbery follows the same choreography: blow the tracks or flag the engineer, force the locomotive to a grinding halt in the wilderness, separate the rich from their valuables, and ride hard before the nearest sheriff can even saddle a horse. The gang behaves as if the rails are still an isolated artery through empty country. A story of speed, surprise, and freedom measured in miles of darkness between stations. But by 1899, the world was changing faster than Dutch's philosophy could keep up. Railroads in the United States were not lonely lines through untouched wilderness. They were the living embodiment of industrial civilization, wired together by telegraph. Nearly every depot, water stop, and junction held an operator, a key, and a direct line to company offices and lawmen. The moment a conductor shouted that masked riders had stopped his train, a message could outrun any horse. Rail companies had learned their lessons the hard way. Men such as Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch had made careers out of hitting trains in the 1880s and early 1890s, targeting payroll cars and express safes. Each success pushed the companies to harden themselves. By the late 1890s, many express cars carried armed guards, safes with time locks, and sometimes even private detectives riding along. The romance of the lone outlaw on horseback was colliding with schedules, ledgers, and repeating rifles behind steel doors. In that world, a gang pulling multiple spectacular train robberies in a short span across a tightly connected region would not remain a rumor for long. Telegraph chatter would spread descriptions and patterns, railroads would coordinate with Pinkertons and marshals, and local posses would not be stumbling blindly through the brush. They would be guided by timetables and reports. How many times could the same faces hold up a luxury train before company men started riding those very cars, waiting behind the curtains? Yet the game stretches that reality, spacing out consequences so the story can breathe. One robbery enrages Leviticus Cornwall, another draws Pinkerton attention, but the true corporate crackdown that history suggests arrives in slow motion. Parceled out for drama, Rockstar is telling a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, not a procedural about rail security. The old ways were dying, but they do not die all at once on screen. That tension between legend and ledger sets the stage for what comes next, as the gang turns from moving trains to fixed targets, and the cost of every last big score begins to rise. From trains to town streets, the gang's next move takes them into the heart of civilization itself, the Valentine Bank. On the surface, it feels familiar. Masks on, guns drawn, a handful of outlaws turning a quiet frontier morning into a story of sudden terror, easy money, and a clean escape into the hills. In the game, the robbery unfolds with cinematic clarity. Arthur, John, and the others burst through the doors, shouting for everyone to get down. Clerks freeze at their desks, a manager is dragged at gunpoint to the back, and the polished wooden counters of a small-town bank become a battlefield. The vault sits there as a simple obstacle, a big metal box waiting to be opened. Threats are made, combinations are given, and when fear is not enough, dynamite finishes the job. The gang emerges with sacks of cash and bonds, pushing through gunfire and chaos, then rides out past stunned townsfolk as if Valentine exists in a bubble, cut off from the wider world. But even in small towns in the 1890s, reality was far less forgiving. By the very beginning of the 1890s, banks across the United States were investing heavily in time-lock safes and reinforced vaults, precisely because the old ways were dying and daylight robberies had become a national fear. A manager could not always open the safe on demand, even if he wanted to. Time locks were designed to make forced openings impossible outside set hours. Walls were thick, doors were layered steel and iron, and insurance companies pushed policies that limited how much physical cash was on hand. The living embodiment of progress, in this case, was a heavy door that did not care about Dutch's philosophy or Arthur's threats. Then there is the response. In the game, the law in Valentine feels isolated, slow, almost sleepy. A few deputies arrive, a few bullets fly, and the gang is gone. In 1899's tightly networked economy, that quiet street would have been connected by telegraph to larger towns, rail depots, even state authorities. A single message could summon a posse from miles away, coordinate roadblocks, or alert railroad and express company detectives whose entire livelihood depended on protecting money in transit. The same lines that carried news of cattle prices and elections could carry descriptions of Arthur's coat, John's horse, or Dutch's voice. Bank robberies did happen. They were part of the world the gang is meant to inhabit, in the truest sense. But they were usually messy, desperate affairs, not a long string of successful cinematic scores. Many would-be robbers misjudged the technology, the courage of tellers, or the speed of the telegraph, and ended up dead in the street or hanging from a jailhouse yard within days. From its humble beginnings as a simple walk-in, grab the cash fantasy, the Valentine job hides how often reality answered with quick capture rather than legendary escape. This is Rockstar's core trade-off. The robbery plays into the West imagined in dime novels and campfire tales, not the West that existed under wires, ledgers, and corporate insurance. The world was changing, but the game slows that change just enough for Dutch's dreams to feel plausible. That tension will only sharpen as the gang moves from rural banks to cities, where the weight of modern civilization presses in from every side. That weight hits hardest the moment the gang rides into Saint Denis. Smokestacks claw at the sky, electric streetlights burn through the night, and the clang of factories bleeds into the rattle of streetcars. Mansions loom over cramped tenements, wealth and misery pressed together on the same cobblestone streets. For men who made their name under open skies, this city feels in the truest sense like the future crashing down on their past. Saint Denis is a story of contrasts, gaslight romance and industrial grime, refined salons and fetid alleys, gilded opera houses and backroom prize fights. It is the living embodiment of Dutch's nightmare, a world where freedom has been replaced by schedules, ledgers, and electric timetables. Yet beneath the cinematic haze, it is also Rockstar's stand-in for a very real place. From its humble beginnings as a frontier port to its rise as a major gateway to the Gulf, New Orleans by 1899 was already an old city, not a boomtown on the edge of civilization. Historically, New Orleans at the turn of the century did have electric streetlights, extensive streetcar lines, and a bustling harbor choked with steamships and cargo. It pulsed with trade, with music, with languages from across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. But it also lived under complex racial politics, Jim Crow segregation, and an entrenched police force that knew its neighborhoods, its families, and its troublemakers. This was not a place where a band of rural outlaws could simply melt into the crowd after blowing open a bank vault. That is where Saint Denis tips from grounded homage into stylized fantasy. Corruption, graft, and organized vice did exist in New Orleans, from crooked ward bosses to dockside smuggling rings. Yet the idea that the Van der Linde gang could repeatedly infiltrate, rob, and escape such a city without being instantly mapped by informants, patrol routes, and telegraph wires stretches plausibility. In a dense urban world of gossip networks, ethnic wards, and watchful police, strangers with heavy pockets and heavier accents would stand out. How long before every saloon, boarding house, and back alley knew their faces? The answer for the game is simple, as long as the story demands. Saint Denis compresses entire eras of American urban life into a single, heightened space, Gilded Age industry belches smoke beside early 20th century labor unrest. Suffragette activism that truly crested in the 1910s marches past carriages and trolleys. There are hints of Prohibition-era speakeasy vice long before the Volstead Act, all folded into 1899 to create a dense stage where the old ways were dying and fast forward. That compression is powerful, but it comes at a cost. Surrounded by telegraph lines, electric grids, and regimented streets, the gang's world of horses, lever actions, and hand-rolled dynamite starts to look strangely out of time. Their enemies begin to change as well, and the weapons turned against them grow more modern than history quite allows. In Saint Denis, the mythic outlaw finally collides with the machinery of civilization, and the cracks in Rockstar's 1899 begin to show. In Saint Denis, the clash between myth and machinery is not just in the skyline, it is in the gunsmoke. On paper, the gang's arsenal is the living embodiment of the closing West: 6-shooters on the hip, lever actions in the saddle scabbard, a battered pump action or double barrel for when talk runs out. In motion, though, Rockstar arms its lost souls with a miniature museum of firearms history, all crammed into 1899. From the very beginning of Arthur's story, the game showers the player with classic revolvers, repeaters, and shotguns, Cattleman and Schofield 6-shooters, sturdy Winchester-style lever actions, pump action and semi-auto shotguns, sleek scoped repeaters that turn ranch rifles into precision instruments. On top of that, early semi-automatic pistols appear in Arthur's hands. A Mauser pistol with a high-capacity magazine, a Borchert-inspired design, and a semi-auto shotgun that spits lead as fast as the trigger can be pulled. It feels powerful, cinematic, almost modern. That is the point. And that is the problem. Individually, many of these weapons are plausible for the era. Revolvers were still common on the frontier, and lever-action rifles had been around for decades. A wealthy rancher, a railroad detective, or a particularly successful outlaw might save for one fine firearm. But a single gang, half-starving in the snow and scraping for train fares, casually cycling through an armory that would make a small garrison jealous, that turns a grounded outlaw tale into a story of compressed technology and exaggerated abundance. Semi-automatic pistols did exist in 1899, and that detail tempts the game toward authenticity. The Mauser C96 was real, impressive, and rare. It was expensive, European, and hardly standard issue for frontier sheriffs or backwoods bandits robbing stagecoaches for grocery money. In the truest sense, a Pinkerton agent flashing a cutting-edge semi-auto on the streets of Saint Denis would be an exception, not the rule. Arthur dual-wielding 2 of them as his default sidearms pushes the setting from plausible into a quiet form of fantasy. The game's philosophy of constant upgrades deepens that distortion. Holsters are engraved, barrels lengthened, triggers refined, scopes mounted and swapped as casually as changing shirts. It mirrors modern shooter design, where progress means higher fire rates, bigger magazines, cleaner sights, but most real 1890s outlaws clung to what they could steal or inherit. Mismatched revolvers and aging rifles that stayed with them for years, not a rotating catalog of bespoke killing tools. Freedom in this world was owning any gun that worked, not endlessly perfecting one. All of this excess foreshadows a broader truth. The more the gang's enemies modernize, their pistols, their rifles, their uniforms, the more Rockstar chooses cinematic gunplay over strict period accuracy. Those sleek scopes, long-range sniper shots, and suspiciously uniform lawman gear will push the timeline even further, hinting that Dutch is not just fighting civilization. He is fighting weapons and tactics borrowed from a future that has not quite arrived yet. Those borrowed weapons do more than shine on Arthur's saddle. They reshape the way violence works in this world. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the frontier is not just a story of closer-range ambushes and panicked saloon shootouts. It becomes a stage for clean, distant executions, where a man on a ridge can erase another man in the street with a single, effortless trigger pull. From the very beginning, the player is pushed toward long-range dominance. Bandits are picked off across frozen valleys at Coulter, guards on Saint Denis rooftops fall before they even know they are being watched, and prison wagons are stopped by shots that cross half a county. The scoped rifle becomes a quiet companion, always there, always reliable, the living embodiment of the one good-shot fantasy that modern cinema adores. But that fantasy is not how most 1890s gunfights worked. Scoped rifles did exist. Sharps, Remington, and Winchester platforms could wear early optics, and specialist marksmen had been using them since the Civil War. Yet those guns were expensive, fragile, and rare. A proper scope was a tool for a dedicated sniper in the army, a competitive shooter, or a wealthy hunter, not standard gear issued to every sheriff's deputy and half-starved outlaw. In the truest sense, a Van der Linde rifle with perfect glass in 1899 would have been a prized oddity, not an item that could be casually bought, sold, and replaced at the nearest gunsmith. Then there is the problem of the bullet itself. In the game, Arthur can rest his rifle, hold his breath, and send round after round across impossible distances, with only a gentle arc and a brief sway to manage. In reality, black powder or early smokeless cartridges meant heavy bullets, inconsistent velocities, and thick clouds of smoke that could blind the shooter after the first shot. Wind would push the round off course, gravity would drag it down, and the slightest error in range estimation could turn a perfect headshot into a clean miss or a gut wound that left a man screaming on the ground. The game brushes all of that aside. Wind is a suggestion, not a force. Bullet drop is a simple curve, not a constant negotiation with physics. Sighting is quick, clean, and cinematic, even when Arthur is firing from a moving horse during a thunderstorm. It feels good. It also feels far more 20th century than 1890s, closer to a World War I sniper film or a modern shooter than to the messy, uncertain volleys that defined real frontier violence. Once again, the pattern is clear. Whenever realism threatens to slow the action or muddy the fantasy, Rockstar chooses the myth, the hyper-competent Western gunfighter whose dreams of control extend even to the horizon. But if the rifles and ranges belong to a future war, what does that say about the men who are paid to chase Dutch across this fading frontier? In Red Dead Redemption 2, the answer seems obvious. The men chasing Dutch are not just lawmen, they are a small army. Deputies pour in from every alley, marshals appear at every crossroads, and the Pinkertons descend on the gang with a precision that feels almost modern. They come in waves, with repeating rifles, pump shotguns, scoped weapons, and even early automatics, turning every confrontation into a running battle rather than a desperate, uneven skirmish. On screen, this creates a story of escalation. More enemies, better guns, bigger shootouts. The posse at Valentine is one thing, the armored cordon around the St. Denis Bank is another. By the time Arthur is riding through cornfields or across icy ridges under withering rifle fire, the game has transformed law enforcement into the living embodiment of an industrial war machine, grinding down the last romantic outlaws of a dying age. But from its humble beginnings, real frontier law did not look like that. In the truest sense, it was a patchwork. Many county sheriffs and small-town deputies relied on whatever they personally owned or could borrow: a tired single-action revolver, a worn lever rifle, maybe a double-barreled shotgun kept behind the bar or under a wagon seat. One man might carry a brand-new Winchester, another a Civil War surplus carbine, a third an old cap-and-ball conversion held together by habit and luck. There was no standardized loadout, no guarantee of cutting-edge hardware, and certainly no endless stream of identically armed reinforcements cresting the nearest hill. Some agencies had access to good firearms, especially in rail hubs or boomtowns, but across most of the West, the gap between a legendary badge and a very ordinary gun could be embarrassingly wide. The world was changing, yet the tools in many holsters still belonged to an earlier decade. The Pinkertons themselves complicate the fantasy even further. In the game, they function as paramilitary strike teams, black-coated phantoms who can appear anywhere, at any time, with clean suits, repeating rifles, and perfect coordination. In reality, Pinkerton agents were, first and foremost, detectives and private guards. Their work revolved around corporate security, labor disputes, and railroads, not endless cross-country gunfights with one wandering outlaw family. Their gear reflected that role. Practical, serviceable, sometimes high quality, but not uniformly elite, and not magically a generation ahead of everyone else. A Pinkerton might carry a solid revolver and a plain rifle, travel by train, and spend more time watching, interviewing, and reporting than charging entrenched positions. The old ways were dying, but the new methods were still rooted in paperwork, pay ledgers, and telegraph wires, not cinematic sieges in every canyon. That is where Rockstar's arms race shows its true inspiration: the spiraling firepower, the swelling head counts. The set-piece shootouts owe more to action cinema than to the uneven, often improvised reality of 1890s law enforcement. It makes the gang's fall feel epic, almost mythic, but it also raises a quieter question. If the weapons are exaggerated, what about the men holding them? Who were the Pinkertons really? And would they ever have chased a gang like Dutch's across half a continent at all? The answer the game gives is simple. The Pinkertons are everywhere. In Red Dead Redemption 2, they are the living embodiment of the noose tightening, the corporate hand of civilization reaching into every valley and hollow where the gang tries to hide. Two named agents, Milton and Ross, haunt Dutch's shadow, appearing at river crossings, train robberies, and bank heists with an almost supernatural sense of timing. From the very beginning, the narrative frames them as personal nemeses. They study Dutch, taunt Arthur, threaten the gang's family, and arrive with a small private army at every major turning point, from the St. Denis Bank to Beaver Hollow. It is a story of pursuit and obsession, of one outlaw philosophy crashing headlong into the cold machinery of a modern investigative agency. But step outside the drama for a moment, and another question emerges. What were the Pinkertons actually doing in 1899? In the real world, their priority list looked very different. By the late 19th century, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency made most of its money guarding railroads, escorting cash shipments, protecting banks, and increasingly breaking strikes and infiltrating labor movements for the country's largest industrialists. The Homestead Strike in 1892, where Pinkerton agents fought steelworkers on the river in Pennsylvania, is far closer to their day-to-day reality than a years-long vendetta against a wandering outlaw camp. They did hunt criminals, but even those cases tell a different story. Earlier in the century, Pinkertons went after nationally known figures such as the James, Younger Gang, men who robbed major railways and became folk legends. Those chases were expensive, dangerous, and usually reserved for targets that threatened huge corporate interests. A relatively small outfit like Dutch's, hitting the occasional train, town bank, or coach on the margins, would not have commanded that same relentless focus, especially once telegraphs, rail schedules, and local passes could handle most responses. What the game does, in the truest sense, is compress an entire web of power into one recognizable logo. The Pinkertons stand in for local sheriffs, state marshals, company guards, railroad detectives, and even federal officials who, in reality, shared the work of hunting fugitives. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but no single agency had the omnipresent reach that Milton's men display on screen. Turning them into a catch-all symbol of corporate power makes the story cleaner, but also flatter. So if real Pinkertons probably would have been more concerned with striking miners than a camp of drifters in the woods, who would have chased Dutch's gang? How far could that chase really have gone before money, jurisdiction, and simple exhaustion got in the way? To answer that, the focus has to shift from the private detectives in their tailored coats to the patchwork system of bounties, posses, and overworked lawmen that actually policed the dying frontier. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the answer seems simple, everyone. Commit a robbery in Valentine, shoot a guard in Rhodes, or misjudge a stagecoach in Annisburg. And suddenly the entire world feels painted with the same wanted posters. A story of one bad decision becomes a story of being hunted in the truest sense, as bounty hunters materialize from the trees, and lawmen somehow know Arthur's face from hundreds of miles away. The game turns crime into a kind of permanent stain. Ride from New Hanover into Lemoyne or across the heartlands toward the Grizzlies, and that red wanted banner clings to the corner of the screen, as if civilization itself has decided this one outlaw is its personal enemy. The philosophy is clear, actions follow a man everywhere, and there is no real escape. Mechanically, it is elegant. Dramatically, it is powerful. Historically, it is a fantasy. In reality, the world was changing, but the law was still a patchwork. Sheriffs, town marshals, and county deputies answered to local voters or local courts. Their authority usually ended at the county line, sometimes at the edge of town. State marshals, federal marshals, and private detectives existed, but they were expensive, overworked, and bound by paperwork, politics, and sheer distance. A sheriff in a dusty New Mexico county did not casually send men riding into Missouri on a hunch. Cross-state pursuits were rare, not routine. To chase one robber across territories required money for horses, food, lodgings, and lost time, plus cooperation from other jurisdictions that might have their own priorities. For a small-time bank job or a drunken shooting, many lawmen made a colder calculation. The offender had fled, the community was safe enough, and the ledger could quietly close. The old ways were dying, but bureaucracy was being born. That is why so many lesser criminals simply vanished. Change a name, grow a beard, marry into a new town, and an outlaw could become a ranch hand, a shopkeeper, even a deputy. Notorious figures with national reputations might draw the attention of federal marshals or big agencies, but the average horse thief did not live under a permanent, continent-wide wanted level. From its humble beginnings, the American West produced more forgotten men than famous legends. RDR2's omnipresent bounty system is the living embodiment of a modern anxiety projected backward. The telegraph and the railroad did exist, but 1890s record-keeping meant telegraph operators, handwritten warrants, and filing cabinets, not instant facial recognition across 5 states. The game imagines a world where every crime is logged, every face remembered, every border meaningless, mirroring a later age of databases and surveillance rather than the messy, lossy communication of Arthur's time. For the Van der Linde gang, this distortion becomes psychological truth. Dutch tells them there is no escape, that civilization is closing in from all directions, and the game's systems prove him right. Every ride feels haunted, every town a trap, every bounty poster a prophecy. But what happens when that feeling of being hunted everywhere collides with the one place the law really could reach without limits? The law could ride into camp. It could burn their wagons, hang their men, drag their bodies through the mud. Historically, there was no sacred space for outlaws on the run, no invisible line the state refused to cross. And yet, inside the Van der Linde camp, another limit appears, less legal than moral, a boundary about who belongs and what kind of hatred is allowed to follow them home. From its humble beginnings, the gang presents itself as a haven for the unwanted, and nowhere is that clearer than in the stories of Lenny Summers and Charles Smith. Lenny, a young black outlaw whose father was murdered by racists, finds not just work, but respect at the campfire. Charles, the living embodiment of mixed heritage in a world that wants him to choose a side, black and native. Hunter and hired gun becomes one of Dutch's most trusted fighters. Inside the gang, they are comrades. Outside, they are targets. The contrast is deliberate. In Valentine and Rhodes, in Saint Denis with its electric lights and segregated balconies, Lenny is followed by suspicion and slurs, while Charles is treated as an exotic threat, a man whose very presence disrupts the fantasy of polite civilization. The game shows this racism plainly. Drunken insults in saloons, backly threats of lynching, lawmen who treat black bodies as disposable evidence. Yet when these same men ride back into camp, the insults stop, the tension melts, and they rejoin a family that seems, in the truest sense, ahead of its time. Historically, multiracial communities did exist on the margins: black cowboys, native scouts, Mexican vaqueros, freedmen farming beside poor whites. But the level of everyday integration and easy camaraderie inside Dutch's outfit reflects a more modern dream of inclusive found family than the brutal reality of 1899. This is a story of freedom and belonging, of loyalty across race lines, but also of omission. The gang's philosophy rejects open bigotry almost as firmly as it rejects banks and railroads, and that too is a fantasy. Rockstar does not ignore the darkness. There are clan gatherings in the woods, bodies hanging from trees, native people pushed to the edges of the map while railroads slice through their hunting grounds. Yet the worst, most systemic horrors of Jim Crow and reservation life remain mostly off-screen. No chain gangs filling county quarries day and night. No full vision of boarding schools tearing native children from their families. No constant, grinding terror that a wrong look at the wrong white man could end a life before sunset. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but for black and native communities that change often meant new forms of captivity, not freedom. Rockstar walks a careful line, acknowledging injustice without fully immersing players in the relentless pressure of that history. So what does that do to the gang itself? Are Dutch's outlaws historical products of a collapsing frontier, or are they a comforting refuge, a pocket of almost modern tolerance hidden inside a past that was far crueler than even this dark story admits? If the gang is a pocket of almost modern tolerance, its women are the clearest sign of just how carefully that pocket has been constructed. In a world where the old ways were dying and new freedoms were still only dreams on the horizon, the Van der Linde camp becomes the living embodiment of a future that had not quite arrived. From the very beginning, the women around Dutch are not background decoration. Abigail cooks, cleans, raises Jack, and still carries the memory of working saloons and surviving on her own before this makeshift family. Karen drinks hard and laughs louder, then walks into a bank with a pistol and a performance, turning a robbery into theater. Tilly, a young black woman with a past in another gang, moves between the washtub and the card table, sharpied, self-possessed, refusing to be anyone's victim again. And Sadie Adler, who begins as a grieving widow in a ruined cabin, becomes the gang's most fearless gun. A story of loss turned into ruthless purpose. There were women in the real West who could ride, shoot, and swear with the best of them, and a few who lived as outlaws in the truest sense. Names like Belle Starr or Pearl Hart show that frontier gender lines were not unbreakable. But a single crew, containing this many outspoken, armed, and relatively empowered women, all given space to argue with the men and to shape the gang's philosophy, is historically unusual. Most outlaw bands were dominated by men, with women locked into domestic roles or kept at the margins, not riding into Saint Denis with a rifle and an opinion. The game makes that even clearer when the story steps away from camp and into the suffragette side quests. In Saint Denis, women march with banners, shout in the streets, and confront hostile crowds. It looks and feels like the 1910s, when mass demonstrations, parades, and arrests became common in cities from New York to Washington. In 1899, agitation for women's suffrage absolutely existed, but it was more fragmented, more polite on the surface, often trapped in parlors and petitions rather than open-air spectacles. So why does the world of Red Dead feel a decade ahead of itself? Rockstar is compressing time. Just as it squeezes 40 years of outlaw legend into Arthur's short life, it pulls later waves of feminist energy backward, using these women to talk about gender in a way that resonates with a modern audience. The result is powerful, but it softens how tight the legal and social constraints truly were. As the gang begins to fracture, that tension only grows. What futures can these women realistically claim when the dream collapses? The paths that open for Abigail and Sadie will blend genuine historical possibility with cinematic wish fulfillment, hinting at how far this world can bend before it finally breaks. In Saint Denis, that question of futures takes to the streets. The player rides into a city of smoke and streetcars and finds something unexpected, a column of women in white marching through the noise with banners raised high. It is a story of voices refusing to stay quiet, of order confronting agitation, of an old social script being torn in public. The suffrage subplot begins modestly enough. A few women gather on the steps, handing out pamphlets, arguing that civilization without their vote is only half-built. Then the scale widens. Organized marches move down the boulevards, banners demand the ballot, and speeches ring out over the clatter of carriages. Crowds jeer, men heckle, and the police hover at the edges, ready to shove, arrest, or simply look away. The world was changing, and Saint Denis becomes the living embodiment of that tension. From its humble beginnings as scattered meetings and petitions, the real suffrage movement in America had been grinding forward for decades by 1899. Women had been speaking, writing, and lobbying since the very beginning of the Republic. By the late 19th century, states in the West such as Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho had already granted women full voting rights. National organizations like the National American Woman Suffrage Association existed, coordinating campaigns across the country. The game gestures toward this history through confident organizers and references to broader movements, hinting at a long struggle already in motion. Yet the way those Saint Denis demonstrations look and feel belongs more to the 1910s than 1899. The crisp uniforms of white dresses, the choreographed marches, the sense of media spectacle and public confrontation echo the later, more militant phase of suffrage activism. In reality, the famous parades in Washington, D.C., the dramatic arrests, and the hunger strikes that captured headlines would not explode into public consciousness until the new century's second decade. Red Dead compresses that arc, pulling future images of protest back into the fading century. This is not a mistake born of ignorance so much as a deliberate choice. By staging 1910-style suffragettes in an 1899 city, Rockstar places the player at a crossroads where the old ways were dying even faster than history strictly allows. Saint Denis becomes a stage where outlaw gunfights, industrial wealth, and modern politics collide in the truest sense, letting one walk from a muddy alley shootout straight into a speech about representation and rights. Is it accurate to the letter of the timeline? Not really. Is it emotionally precise about the pressures closing in on Dutch's world? Absolutely, once again, the pattern is clear. The game bends chronology so its themes can stand side by side: outlaws clinging to freedom, corporations tightening control, women and workers demanding a voice. It favors a story of convergence over a tidy calendar. And if St. Denis is already boiling with 20th century protest a decade early, what other pieces of the future are quietly intruding on 1899, waiting to shatter the gang's last illusions? If time in St. Denis is already running ahead of the calendar, distance in Red Dead Redemption 2 bends even further. The gang's world is vast in feeling but strangely close in practice. A shrunken America where a hard ride can take an outlaw from blizzard to bayou before the campfire dies down. From Coulter's howling peaks to the dripping moss of Lagres, from the wheat fields around Valentine to the smokestacks of St. Denis, the Van der Linde gang rides. They flee a ferry disaster in Blackwater, cross snowy passes, set up at Horseshoe Overlook, drift down into roads and the plantations of Scarlet Meadows, then slip into the swamps and alleys of the city, often in what the story frames as a single in-game day or two. One morning, Arthur is brushing snow off his coat. By nightfall, he is pushing through fog and fireflies, hunting alligators and deaders. In the truest sense, this is the living embodiment of cinematic travel. Horses barely tire, wagons rumble over mountains and mud with only a few grunts of complaint, and a gang hauling supplies. Children and a mobile saloon seems able to uproot its entire life between sunrises. Yet real horse travel, especially with heavy wagons, was slow, grinding, and unforgiving. 20 to 30 miles in a day was respectable. Pushing farther meant risking lamed animals, broken wheels, and exhausted riders. Here, one fast gallop can cross what amounts to multiple states. In reality, the trek from something resembling the Rockies to something resembling the Gulf Coast would have taken days, even weeks, of monotonous progress. Camp chores, hunting, weather delays, and the sheer fatigue of the animals would have dominated the story. But this is a story of movement and escalation, not of waiting for a wheelwright. The reason is simple and deliberate. Rockstar compresses geography, blending the Rockies' jagged grizzlies, the Great Plains' open heartland, the Deep South's plantations, and the Gulf Coast's fetid marshes into a single traversable map. From its humble beginnings in the snow to its final days in the caves of Beaver Hollow, the gang rides through a curated America. Stitched together for maximum variety and narrative flexibility, the world was changing, and the designers wanted every phase of that change within reach. This compression has consequences. It allows the gang to feel omnipresent, able to rob a train in a highland blizzard, shake the law on the prairie, then vanish into swamps where even Pinkertons hesitate to follow. It lets them haunt St. Denis by night and hide in Annisburg's coal-choked misery by day. Yet it also creates an America where distances and jurisdictions are strangely small, where state lines blur and lawmen seem to materialize almost anywhere. Here comes the quiet irony. In a real-sized West, disappearing might have been easier. Hundreds of miles of empty land, slow telegraphs, and sluggish rail schedules could swallow an outlaw family whole. In RDR2's shrunken world, civilization is always just over the next hill. The old ways were dying, the frontier was closing, and no matter how far Dutch rides, history can still catch up to every lost soul in his care. But even as the gang rides through a compressed, ever-encroaching map, another illusion quietly softens their story: survival itself. Hunger, cold, heat, and exhaustion exist in this world, yet they rarely threaten to end the tale. They are obstacles to be managed, not forces that can truly break an outlaw family. From the very beginning, the game presents survival as a system, elegant and contained. Arthur hunts deer and bison, cooks meat over a crackling fire, and tops off his health, stamina, and dead-eye cores with a few bites of stew or a swig from a bottle. A winter coat in Coulter, a poncho in the desert, a tonic for a cough or a wound, and the machine of daily life keeps turning. It is demanding enough to feel immersive, but never so brutal that the player is forced to confront what starvation or real exposure would mean in the truest sense. The real 1890s American countryside told a harsher story. Crop failures could erase a year of work in a single season. A blizzard did not just slow travel, it could trap entire communities, killing the weak and the old. Diseases such as influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis swept through rural towns with terrifying efficiency, especially where doctors were distant and medicine was rudimentary. A bad harvest, a sick cow, or a frozen rail line could mean empty cupboards for weeks. Freedom on the frontier was often the freedom to freeze, to starve, or to bury another child. Seen against that reality, the Van der Linde camp is almost miraculous. Dozens of mouths to feed, including children, elders, and sick men, somehow keep moving from Coulter to Beaver Hollow, with only the occasional complaint about lean times. In a story of constant flight, every relocation would have meant abandoning food stores, losing livestock, leaving behind firewood and shelter. How many wagons would it really take to haul enough flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition for this wandering community? How often would disease tear through tents and bedrolls, turning an outlaw camp into a makeshift infirmary instead of a lively social hub? Rockstar hints at this grinding misery, but rarely lets it become the center of the narrative. Uncle's laziness, Pearson's stew, Molly's decline, Hosea's cough, and Arthur's tuberculosis all gesture toward a world where the body fails long before the bullets do. Yet the camp pot is almost always full, the medicine wagon rarely runs dry, and winters pass with cinematic snow rather than mass graves. The old ways were dying, but they are dying slowly, artfully, on a schedule that serves the story rather than history. In the end, the Van der Linde camp becomes the living embodiment of a softened frontier. It is less a historically plausible outlaw hideout and more a stylized, survivable commune, designed so that dreams and delusions can play out without being smothered by frostbite and famine. And that choice matters, because it turns the gang's tragedy from one of mere physical hardship into something more damning, a philosophy that collapses even when the world is kinder than it should be. That philosophy also depends on a comforting illusion that the gang can simply ride beyond the reach of civilization. Dutch's world is one of remote camps, hidden valleys, and the constant promise that the next horizon will finally be far enough. From its humble beginnings in Coulter to the swamps of Lemoyne and the caves of Beaver Hollow, the gang moves as if distance alone can erase its sins. On the surface, the game makes that belief feel plausible. Snow-choked passes, foggy bayous, and lonely plains frame the gang as ghosts slipping through a half-tamed world. A campfire in a clearing, a wagon tucked beneath a cliff, a story of family huddled against the dark. In the truest sense, the camera invites the viewer to inhabit Dutch's fantasy, that the United States is still a patchwork of empty spaces where an outlaw can vanish with enough grit and enough horses. But the world was changing faster than Dutch's imagination. By 1899, telegraph lines had already stitched much of the country together, from the Atlantic coast to the territories that Dutch pretends are still wild. Those wooden poles that line the roads in Red Dead Redemption 2 are not just decoration. In reality, they were the nervous system of a new America, flashing descriptions, warrants, and bank reports across hundreds of miles in minutes. A man could outrun a posse. He could not outrun a wire. The same is true of the rails Dutch both robs and rides. The gang treats trains as moving banks, symbols of corporate greed, and the old ways were dying. But historically, they were also the spine of law enforcement. A blown safe in Valentine, a murdered guard outside Annisburg, a bank manager in St. Denis babbling about a tall man with a scar and a Dutch accent. Those stories would not stay local. Telegraph operators and railroad clerks were the living embodiment of a new order, turning scattered crimes into a single national legend. Consider the gang's greatest spectacles: the early train heists in the heartlands, the chaos in Rhodes, the St. Denis bank job that leaves Hosea and Lenny dead on the cobblestones. In the game, each region reacts, but the sense of scale remains strangely contained, as if the gang's infamy is fenced in by the edge of the map. In reality, such brazen violence, repeated over months, would have made Dutch's name known in cities he never set foot in, long before Pinkerton's ride into camp. Rockstar fills the skyline with telegraph wires and sends locomotives screaming through the landscape, yet often treats them as atmospheric detail instead of the primary reason the old outlaw lifestyle was dying. That choice keeps the focus on personal betrayal rather than technological inevitability, but it also hides how doomed Dutch's dream truly is. His refusal to grasp this new reality is not only a character flaw, it is a historical blind spot, one that makes his promise of one last score impossible from the very beginning. And when that illusion finally breaks, the gang discovers that distance is not the only thing closing in. Distance is gone, but Dutch keeps talking as if the horizon is still wide open. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and yet his speeches remain frozen in an era that no longer exists. Repeated so often they start to sound less like inspiration and more like a spell he is casting on himself. From its humble beginnings, his rhetoric had been the living embodiment of the gang's dreams. Around campfires in the 1870s and 1880s, Dutch spoke of freedom, of family, of a roaming life beyond the reach of civilization. He promised that every robbery was another step toward a final escape, that one last big score would buy land in some distant country where the law could never follow. In the truest sense, it was a story of loyalty and belief, of an outlaw philosophy that painted theft as justice and murder as unfortunate necessity. But in 1899, the script never changes, even as the stage does. After Blackwater, after Coulter, after Rhodes and St. Denis, Dutch keeps returning to the same phrases. One more job, one more train, one more bank. When plans collapse, it is never his fault. Someone has betrayed them, the Pinkertons are conspiring, the world is stacked against them. The repetition becomes eerie. A man who once improvised now hits the same lines on cue, insisting that they just need money long after it is clear that money is not what is running out. History itself is closing in. Railroads crisscross the continent, telegraph wires carry news faster than any horse, and corporations hire agencies like the Pinkertons to guard their interests. In reality, a single gang could not simply shoot its way through the combined force of federal law, private security, and industrial capital. By 1899, most legendary gunfights are already in the past, and the frontier myth Dutch worships is a fading memory. His promise that violence and one last heist can solve what is essentially a structural problem has drifted from idealism into delusion. So his language shifts. Early on, he attacks the system in broad, almost poetic terms, railing against civilization as a cage and presenting the gang as a family of misfits holding on to freedom. Later, the same words become weapons turned inward. Freedom means doing what Dutch says. Betrayal means questioning his plans. The philosophy that once welcomed lost soul and stranger alike narrows into a paranoid creed that mostly protects his pride and authority. Here the gap opens, wide and unbridgeable, between what Dutch says and what the world actually is. Arthur hears it in every recycled speech. John hears it in every empty promise to go back for Abigail and Jack. How many times can a man swear this is the last job before the words lose all meaning? That widening dissonance becomes the moral and historical breaking point, the moment when some in the gang start to measure Dutch's rhetoric not against their memories, but against the cold, advancing reality around them. And once that measurement begins, the entire story of the Van der Linde gang begins to unravel. That unraveling has a date, a place, and a body count. It has a name whispered through the entire story of Red Dead Redemption 2. It is Blackwater. From its humble beginning, the Van der Linde gang survived on mobility and myth, slipping through the cracks between wilderness and civilization. Blackwater is where those cracks close. A wealthy, growing town on the upper Montana River, with paved streets, electric lights, and a bustling port, is not some dusty frontier outpost. Yet the gang attempts a ferry robbery there, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, lawmen, and respectable citizens. The result is a massacre, civilians dead, lawmen dead, gang members dead, the boat in flames, and Dutch shooting a woman on the dock. That is not just a failed job. That is a national scandal. By 1899, a town in the mold of Blackwater would have been the living embodiment of the new America. It would have had rail connections, regular steamship traffic, telegraph lines running out in every direction, and businessmen with direct access to state governors and federal representatives. A disaster on that scale, in that setting, would not remain a local embarrassment. It would become a test of authority. Who controls this modern world? Outlaw gangs clinging to the old ways, or the institutions of an increasingly centralized state? In the truest sense, the game shows that impact in miniature. Blackwater is swarming with Pinkertons, patrols, and bounty hunters, and the gang is forced to flee into the blizzard at Coulter like hunted animals. Yet once they ride out of immediate range, the pursuit strangely loosens. Dutch's people rob trains, banks, and entire plantations. They shoot their way through Rhodes, Valentine, and even St. Denis, and still operate as a semi-coherent outfit for months. With newspapers, telegraphs, and a grieving public demanding justice, Could a group responsible for a ferry massacre really keep resurfacing across the region without a far more coordinated, crushing response? Historically, the answer is almost certainly no. By the turn of the century, the railroads, the U.S. Marshals, and state authorities were highly motivated to make examples of high profile outlaws. Telegraph descriptions, wanted posters, and political pressure would have turned Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and John into targets not just for a few Pinkerton agents, but for sheriffs, posses, and ambitious politicians eager to prove that the old ways were dying. The gang would be hunted as domestic terrorists, not as troublesome bandits. Rockstar's solution is elegant, but telling. The Blackwater job is kept deliberately vague, its details obscured by trauma, rumor, and Dutch's evasions. It functions less as a documented crime and more as a mythic original sin, the moment when the gang crosses an invisible line and can never return. From that point on, the narrative commits to legend over logistics. The Van der Linde gang ceases to be a plausible criminal enterprise and becomes a story of doomed outlaws running not just from the law, but from history itself. And that tension between what would happen and what must happen for the tragedy to unfold only grows sharper as the chase closes in. That leap into legend becomes literal the moment the storm hits and the screen fills with black water and broken wood. One chapter ends with a doomed bank heist in St. Denis. The next opens with American outlaws coughing up seawater on a Caribbean beach, stranded on an island that feels torn from a different story, a different century, a different world. Guarma is a rupture. From its humble beginnings as a grounded tale of trains, banks, and Pinkertons, the narrative suddenly throws the Van der Linde gang into a pulp adventure between a ruthless sugar baron, his armed thugs, the brutalized workers in his fields, and a local rebellion fighting for freedom with rifles, machetes, and desperation. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but now staged under palm trees and plantation houses rather than pines and prairie grass. The old ways were dying in America. On Guarma, they seem frozen in place, preserved in blood and molasses. Historically, the timing is not impossible. Around 1899, the United States really was entangled across the Caribbean and Latin America, projecting power into Cuba, Puerto Rico, and beyond as corporations and gunboats followed the flag. Yet Guarma does not behave like a precise snapshot of any single island or uprising. Its mix of Spanish colonial architecture, quasi-banana republic politics, and turn-of-the-century imperial intrigue feels in the truest sense like a generic colonial adventure setting, the living embodiment of a dozen pulp novels compressed into one space. The revolution imagery only deepens that sense of compression. The firing squads, the jungle ambushes, the ragged rebels posing in front of stone, ruins all echo real uprisings and occupations scattered from the 1870s through the early 1900s. Fragments of slave revolts, echoes of the Cuban War of Independence, hints of later U.S. interventions and corporate coups all bleed together. The world was changing over decades. Guarma turns that long, uneven history of empire and resistance into a single, stylized battlefield the gang stumbles through in a matter of days. In that battlefield, the Van der Linde gang becomes something with no real historical parallel. American outlaws, already anachronistic in 1899, briefly reinvented as guerrilla fighters in a Caribbean revolution. Even the situational irony is unmistakable. Men who rob stagecoaches for personal gain suddenly blowing up artillery for someone else's cause. There were mercenaries, filibusters, and adventurers who meddled in foreign revolutions. But Dutch, Arthur, and Javier are not modeled on any specific group. Their presence is a genre homage more than a plausible side chapter. Guarma is Rockstar stepping fully into pulp fiction mode, trading geographic and political accuracy for heightened mood and emotional pressure. The island isolates the gang, strips away the illusion of control, and shows Dutch's philosophy crumbling when it is no longer framed by the American frontier he claims to understand. It is a detour, but also a mirror, reflecting what Dutch believes he is. A freedom fighter against civilization, against what he actually is. And when the survivors finally sail away from that fever dream of empire and rebellion, the question hangs over them like storm clouds. What exactly followed them home from that island, and what will it do to the family that returns? What followed them home from Guarma was not just trauma and grief. It was a new voice in Dutch's ear, a man who had not bled with them at Blackwater, who had not starved with them in the snow, but who would become the living embodiment of the gang's final betrayal. Micah Bell enters the story almost as an afterthought, a loudmouthed newcomer picked up in a jail cell, more nuisance than profit. From its humble beginnings, his role seems simple: an extra gun, an eager outlaw who flatters Dutch's ego and echoes his rhetoric about freedom and civilization. Yet step by step, camp by camp, Micah climbs. In Valentine, he is reckless muscle. In Saint Denis, he is an aggressive advisor. By Beaver Hollow, he stands at Dutch's shoulder as favored enforcer, while longtime pillars like Hosea and Arthur are doubted, sidelined, or dead. The revelation that Micah has been working with Agent Milton and the Pinkertons is framed as the shattering twist. One rotten apple, one snake in the garden. In the truest sense, informants were a real plague on outlaw bands. Turncoats did bring down gangs from the James Younger outfit to local train robbers whose own cousins sold them out. Yet to hang the entire collapse of the Van der Linde gang on Micah's treachery is to miss the wider noose tightening around them. The world was changing. Telegraph lines, railroads, federal marshals, and private detectives made the old ways of roaming robbery nearly impossible to sustain by 1899. Here the game performs a clever sleight of hand. It gives that tightening historical pressure a face, a sneer, a filthy coat. Micah becomes a lightning rod for hatred, an easy target for blame in a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family torn apart from within. Is it satisfying to imagine that without this one traitor, the gang might have ridden on into the sunset? Certainly. Is it plausible? Far less so. Real Pinkertons in this era spent more energy crushing labor strikes and guarding corporate rail interests than chasing a single fading gang, but with rail networks and telegraphs spanning the continent. Dutch's brand of outlaw freedom was already living on borrowed time. A pattern interrupt hides in plain sight. The real tragedy is not that Dutch trusts Micah, it is that he needs to. Dutch's willingness to believe a recent recruit over Arthur, over John, over the memory of Hosea, shows a man clinging to a philosophy that civilization itself has rendered obsolete. Admitting that the world, not just one man, has turned against him would mean admitting that his entire life's work has failed. So he chooses the comforting lie, whispered by a murderer. Even if Micah had never ridden into that jail cell, the gang's fate would not have changed much. The old ways were dying, the frontier was closing, and the Van der Linde gang was already a relic. Galloping toward a future that had no place for them, Saint Denis is where the dream finally hits a wall. Not a canyon ridge or a government ambush in the wilderness, but brick, marble, and electric light. The living embodiment of the new America does not meet the Van der Linde gang on its terms. It forces the gang to come to it, and Dutch walks them straight into the jaws of civilization. The bank job is supposed to be the masterstroke, the grand answer to Blackwater. Dutch and Hosea talk through an elaborate plan, casing the building, bribing guards, timing the city's rhythms, trusting that their outlaw philosophy can still outthink a modern world of telegraphs and patrol routes. Then the doors blow, the vault is opened, and for a heartbeat it almost feels like the old days, until the Pinkertons arrive in force, not as a handful of deputies on horseback, but as a coordinated urban assault, flooding the square with rifles, shotguns, and authority. Hosea is not killed in a crossfire. He is dragged out into the street and executed, held up in front of the bank as a message. In the truest sense, this is not just a death. It is a public demonstration that the state now has the power to turn an outlaw legend into a spectacle. Historically, an operation of this scale in a major city would have been the end of the story. Telegraphs would crackle, rail lines would carry descriptions, and every marshal from St. Denis to Annisburg would be on alert within hours. Instead, the gang somehow blasts its way onto a riverboat and vanishes into the night. The world was changing, but the narrative bends so that this massacre becomes fuel rather than finality. Hosea's death removes the one man who consistently reminds Dutch that the old ways were dying, that the age of Robin Hood rhetoric and frontier improvisation is over. With him gone, the camp loses its pragmatic conscience and drifts fully into Dutch's fantasy of one last score, one last escape, one last ride to freedom. In reality, an urban bank robbery gone that wrong, with a senior conspirator shot in front of a crowd, would have shattered the gang's ability to regroup. Safe houses would be burned, informants squeezed, city authorities embarrassed into relentless pursuit. The Pinkertons of 1899 were busy breaking strikes and guarding railroads. A crew that attacked a central bank in a city modeled on New Orleans would suddenly be worth every dollar of corporate and political attention. But the story pushes them onward. It turns Hosea's body on the cobblestones into an emotional engine, not a historical dead end. From its humble beginnings as a partnership between two con men, the gang is now a lost soul, wandering through a world that no longer has room for it. Without Hosea, Dutch's choices will grow more erratic, more cruel, and less plausible, dragging Arthur and John toward even more impossible schemes that reality itself should have already refused. Without Hosea, Dutch's schemes grow stranger, riskier, more detached from the world around him. At the same time, another slow disaster begins inside the gang's most loyal enforcer. Arthur's illness does not arrive with thunder or gunfire. It begins with a cough. In the cramped air of that debtor's home, when Arthur is beaten and spits blood after Thomas Downs coughs in his face, the moment barely registers amid the noise of survival. But from that instant, his story becomes a story of erosion rather than conquest. The cough lingers, the fatigue creeps in, and the man who once hauled wounded friends through blizzards now struggles to mount a horse. Each wheeze forces him to confront his life and choices, to measure Dutch's philosophy against the reality of a body that is failing. For a man who has lived by the gun, the most terrifying enemy is one he cannot shoot. Historically, tuberculosis was not an intimate anomaly. It was everywhere. In the late 19th century, it was a leading cause of death across Europe and America, killing millions, haunting tenements, farms, and frontier towns. Entire families in real 1899 communities lost multiple children to what was called the White Plague. Yet in Red Dead Redemption 2, the disease is largely contained to Arthur. Camps are not filled with hacking coughs. Valentine's saloon is rowdy, not sickly. Saint Denis, the living embodiment of booming industrial civilization, shows grime and poverty, but not the constant funerals and sanatoriums that define the era. That choice is deliberate. Arthur's tuberculosis functions less as epidemiology and more as symbolism. His lungs are the physical manifestation of the gang's moral rot, the proof that the old ways were dying not just out there in the world, but inside the man who had carried Dutch's dreams on his back. As the gang fractures, Arthur's body fractures. As Dutch's promises grow thinner, so does Arthur's breath. The illness becomes the mirror of the dying West itself, an outlaw era suffocating under the weight of progress, railroads, Pinkertons, and its own accumulated sins. Medically, his symptoms are broadly plausible: the chronic cough, the wasting frame, the fevers that leave him reeling in the mud. But the timing is suspiciously neat. His collapse aligns perfectly with narrative beats, the revelation of Dutch's betrayal, the protection of John's family, the final climb toward that last sunrise. Real tuberculosis could drag on for years, remit unexpectedly, or kill swiftly without such elegant structure. In the truest sense, the disease bends to story logic. And that is the point. Even the most grounded parts of this tale, the blood on Arthur's handkerchief and the doctors of Saint Denis, are carefully shaped to serve the epic arc of the Van der Linde legend, rather than the messy sprawl of real 1899 health crises. The game chooses one doomed outlaw's lungs over crowded hospital wards, one lost soul over a continent of anonymous graves. The question is, if Arthur's own body is this stylized, how much else in this world has been quietly rewritten for the sake of the myth? Arthur becomes the answer to that question. His body may be stylized, but his mind turns into the game's most honest instrument, slowly cutting through the legend around him. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, he shifts from believer to witness, from Dutch's sharpest knife to the reluctant historian of a dying dream. From the very beginning, Arthur is the loyal enforcer, the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. Rob the rich, spare the poor, fight civilization in the name of freedom and family. He does not debate, he executes. Blackwater, Coulter, the early camps, his journal entries there echo Dutch's voice, just rougher and more practical. The world was changing, but Arthur still believes Dutch can outthink it, outrun it, outgun it. That faith erodes one plan at a time. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, he watches Dutch gamble with lives in Rhodes, in Saint Denis, in every reckless escalation against the O'Driscolls, Angelo Bronte, and Cornwall's rail empire. The binary contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Dutch talks about ideals, but the results are bodies, widows, and orphans. Arthur's questions begin quietly, in the margins of his journal, where he notes not just the robberies, but the telegraph wires, the rail schedules, the factory smoke over Saint Denis that proves the old ways were dying whether Dutch accepted it or not. Through those pages and his conversations, Arthur becomes, in the truest sense, the gang's internal historian. He records the encroaching modernity that the game compresses into 1899, electric streetcars rattling through Saint Denis, organized police patrols, Pinkertons with files and photographs, a world where long-distance travel, information, and money move faster than any horse. Dutch keeps speaking as if it is still 1875. Arthur starts to see that the calendar has moved on. Pattern Interrupt, the most feared outlaw in camp, begins to care more about farmers than gunfights. His sympathy for ordinary people grows almost in spite of himself. Helping a rancher defend land from Leviticus Cornwall's men, escorting railroad workers. Watching immigrant families scrape out a living on the edge of the map, Arthur's perspective shifts. His heart drifts toward the real 1899 majority. Workers, smallholders, mothers trying to keep children fed, while corporations and rail barons carve up the country. Dutch, meanwhile, clings to the fantasy of a grand social rebellion. Arthur finally names the contradiction aloud. They are not liberators. They are just thieves. That single admission detonates the romantic outlaw myth the gang has been selling from its humble beginnings, and the myth the game initially invites the audience to enjoy. Every train robbery, every bank job, every dead lawman suddenly looks different. Was this freedom, or just self-interest wrapped in pretty speeches? In the end, Arthur's awakening is bigger than his betrayal by Dutch. He is waking up from the entire fantasy of the West itself, realizing that the legend of noble outlaws holding back faceless civilization never truly existed the way it has been told. One man's disillusionment becomes a mirror, reflecting how far the story has drifted from history, and how hard the modern world will hit those still chasing a dream already gone. That disillusionment lands hardest on John Marston, because his dream is painfully simple. Not a legend, not a revolution, just a small piece of quiet. From the very beginning, his story is a story of someone trying to step off the stage while the narrative drags him back into the spotlight. John's disappearances are treated as desertions inside the camp, but they are also rehearsals for another life. He runs off for months, trying to live with Abigail and Jack away from Dutch's chaos, trying to trade gunsmoke for fence posts and bank ledgers for feed bills. Each time, he returns to find the gang poorer, angrier, more desperate. And each time Dutch folds that return into his philosophy of loyalty and betrayal. Leaving is not just a choice. In Dutch's mind, it is treason. Historically, that was only half true. Walking away from a criminal outfit in 1899 could be dangerous, especially if the leader was violent or paranoid. But the world was changing in ways that quietly helped runaways. Railroads and steamships moved people farther and faster than ever. Telegraphs and newspapers spread headlines, but local sheriffs still dealt in rumors, not databases. America's mobility and patchy records meant a determined outlaw could simply ride 3 states over, change a name, and become a ranch hand or laborer whose past was only a whisper. The old ways were dying, but anonymity was still very much alive. Red Dead Redemption 2 deliberately tightens that noose. The game makes John's exit attempt feel almost impossible, not because of the Pinkertons, but because Dutch turns distance into betrayal and hesitation into sin. Every time John tries to step back, Dutch drags him into a bigger scheme: the Rhodes feud, the St. Denis Bank, the mad dreams in Guarma and Beaver Hollow. The emotional stakes are heightened until it seems that one man leaving will collapse the entire world they have built, even as that world is already collapsing on its own. Yet history is full of men who did what John cannot. Former rustlers became anonymous cowhands. Train robbers melted into small towns as blacksmiths, drifters, or aging ranchers. Their legends, when they had them, did not follow them through federal warrants and telegraph lines. They faded at the county line. In the truest sense, many of them became the living embodiment of the West's quiet epilogue rather than its bloody climax. John's struggle, then, is not only with Dutch's possessive vision of family, it is with the story itself, a narrative that refuses to let him become one more nameless ex-outlaw swallowed by ordinary civilization. The game compresses decades of frontier myth into his 8-year arc, and demands a grand, tragic ending where history often delivered a shrug. Why let him vanish when he can be sacrificed? Why grant him obscurity when martyrdom is more cinematic? In that tension between historical possibility and narrative necessity, John becomes the lost soul who proves how far this tale has drifted from the way most outlaws actually disappeared. And that tension does not stop with John. It shapes how the game handles the law, the Pinkertons, and the very machinery of pursuit that keeps the gang running until there is nowhere left to go. That machinery of pursuit presses hardest in the gang's final months, and this is where the story of the Van der Linde camp turns from improbable to almost impossible. The hideouts become more remote, more paranoid, more drenched in fear. Yet they remain, in the truest sense, bustling villages in the woods, with stew pots simmering, children playing, and semi-regular wagons hauling in food, ammunition, and gossip. Beaver Hollow is the clearest example. On paper, it is exactly where a hunted outlaw band should end up, a damp cave in an unhealthy forest, far from rail lines and polite civilization. But listen to the sounds that echo through those trees. There is a full-time cook, a designated medic, women washing clothes, men repairing guns, a boy with toys scattered in the mud. This is not a handful of fugitives living off whatever they can steal in a night. This is a small, recognizable community maintaining routines, rituals, and supply lines under the nose of a nation that has already put a price on every recognizable face. Historically, that is where the fantasy begins to fray. By this point, the gang is not just wanted for Blackwater. There is the Rhodes tragedy, the St. Denis bank disaster, the brazen train and stage robberies, and multiple massacres that leave trails of bodies across several states. Telegraph wires crisscross the map. Railroads tie towns together. Pinkertons, marshals, and local sheriffs share names, descriptions, and tactics. In a world where the old ways were dying and the state's reach was growing, how long could a camp of 20 or more fugitives really stay intact, cooking stew in the same pot every night? Real outlaw outfits under this level of pressure did not cling to one another in such numbers. They splintered. Some members disappeared into distant territories under false names. Others turned informant when the noose or the cell door loomed. Many were picked off in ones and twos, ambushed on lonely roads or dragged from beds in frontier boarding houses. A story of loyalty, betrayal, and survival usually ended not with a single grand siege, but with years of attrition, compromise, and quiet surrender. The Van der Linde gang, from its humble beginnings, was always the living embodiment of a philosophy, not just a roster of criminals, and the game protects that idea. The camp stays whole longer than history would allow, because the narrative needs a hearth, a place where freedom and family can be seen decaying in real time. Without that central hub in the final acts, Dutch's delusions would fracture off-screen, and Arthur's awakening would lose the daily contrast of meals, arguments, and whispered doubts around the fire. So those last camps become ghost towns in the making, communities already dead in historical terms, just waiting for the bullets to catch up. The question is not whether they will fall. The question is how the law that surrounds them will finally close its hand, and what that says about the new world rising beyond the trees. By Beaver Hollow, the hand has already closed. What remains is watching Dutch van der Linde decide whether he will open his eyes to the new world around him, or drag everyone down rather than admit he has been wrong. The answer turns a charismatic outlaw philosopher into something far uglier, a paranoid warlord clinging to a crown made of ghosts. The descent is not sudden. It is a story of small choices hardening into unforgivable ones. At Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, Dutch risks the gang for bold scores. By Beaver Hollow, he abandons wounded allies in the mud and calls it strategy. He leaves Arthur to bleed in St. Denis, shrugs at John rotting in Sisika, and treats Hosea's death as an inconvenience rather than a shattering loss. Each betrayal is wrapped in speeches about loyalty, but the pattern is clear. Dutch's loyalty now runs only one way, toward himself. With that shift comes a new brutality. Dutch once claimed to rob the rich and powerful, to strike at railroads and banks as symbols of a corrupt civilization. Late in 1899, those ideals are gone. He blows up a bridge used by ordinary workers, slaughters an army patrol on Guarma, and contemplates murdering an entire family in Annisburg just to steal a coal company's payroll. These are not the actions of an idealistic rebel. In the truest sense, they are the actions of a man who has mistaken cruelty for strength. The strangest part is who he trusts as the world closes in. While Charles, Sadie, and Arthur keep dragging the gang back from the brink, Dutch turns to Micah Bell, a man whose every grin smells of betrayal. Micah feeds Dutch's worst instincts, whispering about traitors and Pinkerton plots, until Dutch sees conspiracy in every tired face around the campfire. When a leader believes that only the loudest flatterer is honest, how long before the entire camp becomes a prison of delusions? By this stage, Dutch has severed himself from the historical outlaw tradition he once romanticized. The great frontier robbers of earlier decades stole to stay ahead of the law, to keep moving as the rails and telegraphs spread. Dutch, by contrast, is no longer robbing to live free. He is lashing out to protect an image of himself as the living embodiment of resistance. Even as the world was changing faster than his gun hand could follow, that refusal to recognize 1899 for what it is turns him into a relic. He rails against banks while using their notes, mocks progress while hiding in a cave lit by industrial lanterns, and rides past telegraph poles that make his entire philosophy obsolete. The old ways were dying before Dutch ever rode out. His tragedy is believing that shooting at trains could stop time. Rockstar uses that breakdown as more than character drama. Dutch's collapse exposes the myth of the noble outlaw resisting civilization as fundamentally self-serving, a fantasy that, when pushed to its logical end, strips away family, freedom, and even basic humanity. By the time the last bullets fly, Dutch is not just wrong about history. He is actively denying it, and that denial is about to face its final reckoning on a cold mountainside. That reckoning does not arrive in a courtroom or a prison yard. It comes on a mountainside, in the snow, at the very edge of the world Dutch always promised. The gang's story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, narrows to a single path cut into ice and rock, with Arthur and John climbing toward a last stand that feels ripped from an earlier century. The final ascent is simple and brutal. Wind howls, rifles crack in the distance, and the gang that once filled whole camps with laughter and arguments has been reduced to a handful of desperate figures dragging themselves up through the drifts. Arthur and John move past dead or dying comrades, past the last traces of campfires and wagons, until even the idea of family feels thin in the cold. Each step higher leaves civilization behind and peels away everything except survival, loyalty, and the looming shadow of betrayal. In the truest sense, this is a classic Western ending, not an 1899 one. Two men climbing toward a ridge, hunted by lawmen, stalked by a traitor, headed for an inevitable confrontation under an open sky. It is the living embodiment of the high noon myth, the outlaw facing down his past, his principles, and his enemies, in a place where the world itself seems to hold its breath. But that myth belongs more to the 1870s than to the dawn of the 1900s. By the time the world was changing at the turn of the century, the old ways were dying in quieter, less cinematic ways. Famous gunfights were already history. Railroads, telegraphs, and organized law meant most criminals were tracked with paperwork, not posses. Careers ended in courtrooms, in cramped jails, in sudden, messy ambushes on back roads, not in operatic duels on mountaintops with personal betrayers and ex-fathers staring each other down. How many real outlaws got a final speech on a snowy peak? Almost none. Yet Rockstar leans deliberately into that anachronism. This remote, timeless ridge is almost outside the calendar, stripped of St. Denis streetcars, Pinkerton files, and any sign of modern civilization. Up here, there are no telegraph lines, no factories, no suffrage marches or labor strikes, only rock, snow, and the echo of gunfire. It is from its humble beginnings as a simple escape route that the mountain becomes a stage, letting the game briefly step outside strict history to deliver a pure genre ending. And that is the final irony. The gang does not die in St. Denis, under electric lights and factory smoke, in the real America closing around them. They die in a place that looks exactly like the West Dutch always imagined, untouched, heroic, suspended in myth. The fantasy wins the framing, even as the real future waits below, in cities and courts and rail depots, ready to claim whoever survives the snow. Up on that mountain, the fantasy finally demands its price. After years of riding through an America that no longer exists, Arthur Morgan is forced into a last choice that feels monumental, heroic, the living embodiment of the noble outlaw's final stand. Help John escape or cling to Dutch. Confront Micah or crawl away. die facing the sunrise or die in the dirt while the men he trusted walk past. In the truest sense, Arthur's ending is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions crashing into rock and snow. When he turns back to help John reach that ridge, he is not just saving a friend, he is rejecting the entire philosophy that raised him. Dutch's grand speeches about freedom, civilization, and destiny collapse into something much quieter, a man telling another man to go home to his family. The world was changing, and Arthur, coughing blood on the trail, finally understands that survival means a farm, not a gun belt. His last confrontation with Micah seals that realization. Whether Arthur dies watching the sun rise over the valley or bleeding under Dutch and Micah's shadow, depending on his honor, the emotional shape is the same. He dies believing Dutch was wrong. He dies believing that a smaller, more grounded life might still be possible for John, Abigail, and Jack, far from St. Denis lights and Pinkerton files. For Arthur, that hope is enough. For history, it is already too late. Because the era he seems to represent, the classic Wild West of roaming outlaws and empty frontiers, had mostly ended before he was even born. By 1899, railroads crisscrossed the continent, telegraphs stitched towns together, and real Pinkertons spent more time breaking strikes than chasing small gangs into snowy passes. The old ways were dying, but in Arthur's story, they die on cue, theatrically, at the exact moment the camera needs them to. Is that history? Or is that myth management? Arthur becomes a martyr to a delayed legend. From its humble beginnings in Dutch's campfire promises to its bloody finale on that mountaintop, his life is bent around an outlaw fantasy that the game's own setting quietly undermines. The suffragettes in St. Denis, the electric lights, the corporate security forces and rail depots all whisper that this man on a horse is already obsolete. Yet his death is framed as the end of an era that ended years ago. That is the paradox at the heart of Red Dead Redemption 2. Arthur's story gives emotional closure to the fantasy of the noble outlaw, even as the wider world on screen proves how implausible that fantasy has become. He is not only a victim of Dutch's ego or the Pinkertons' pursuit. He is a victim of the entire romantic Western narrative that refuses to admit when history has moved on. And if Arthur dies for a myth, what does that say about the man who tries to live after him? If Arthur dies for a myth, John tries to do something even harder. He tries to live without it. The epilogue shifts from train robberies and collapsing camps to a man buying fence posts, hammering nails, and arguing with a bank manager. It is still a story of the West, but now the shootouts share screen time with loan payments and livestock feed. From its humble beginnings, Beecher's hope is not a grand homestead won through rugged freedom, but a fragile dream financed on credit. John takes whatever work civilization will give him, hauling lumber, breaking horses, shoveling manure, and serving as a hired hand on another man's spread before he owns a single acre himself. He is trying, in the truest sense, to replace the gang with a family, replacing Dutch's philosophy of violent resistance with a quieter creed of regular work, steady income, and coming home at night to Abigail and Jack. History offers echoes of this arc. Many former cowboys, drifters, and even petty outlaws did eventually settle on small ranches or farms as the old ways were dying. Yet the path was rarely as clean or as swift as the game's rousing montage. Under the Homestead Act and its successors, claimants were expected to file paperwork, prove continuous residence, improve the land, and wait years before gaining full title. A bad drought, a harsh winter, or one missed payment could wipe out everything. The frontier was not just wide-open land. It was a maze of deeds, surveys, and distant bureaucrats. The epilogue compresses all of that into a few seasons and a handful of missions. John goes from day laborer to landowner with remarkable speed, paying off a substantial loan through a series of cinematic jobs and conveniently timed windfalls. In reality, that transition often took a decade of grinding labor, chronic debt, and legal uncertainty, with families living in half-finished shacks while arguing over boundary lines and water rights. Here, the barn rises in a stirring sequence, the house stands straight, and the ranch becomes the living embodiment of a second chance almost as soon as John decides he wants one. Yet the world was changing, and the story will not let him forget what he has been. Old enemies, government agents, and unresolved scores ride straight through his fences, reminding him that the outlaw past cannot be buried under fresh timber. Does a man stop being an outlaw when he puts on a work shirt, or when the people hunting him decide they are finished? The constant intrusion of revenge and unfinished business keeps the epilogue tethered to genre expectations, even as it gestures toward a more historically grounded life of chores, neighbors, and Sunday dinners. In the end, John's homestead exists on borrowed time. Beecher's Hope leads directly into the first Red Dead Redemption, where the federal government arrives with automobiles, telegraphs, and legal authority to force him back into the gun. The state finishes what history started, using modern tools to erase the last traces of the old outlaw world, one reluctant rancher at a time. In Red Dead Redemption, that borrowed time runs out. The story of John Marston ends not with quiet retirement, but with a government ultimatum delivered at gunpoint. Federal agents Edgar Ross and Archer Fordham arrive at Beecher's Hope with automobiles in the yard, telegraphs at their back, and federal warrants in their pockets. They take John's freedom and turn it into leverage, forcing him to hunt down the last ghosts of the van der Linde gang in exchange for a promise of amnesty that always feels a little too clean. John rides out to kill or capture Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and finally Dutch himself, acting as a state-sponsored bounty hunter against the only family he ever knew. It is a cruel symmetry. The man once rescued from a noose by Dutch now stalks his former brothers on behalf of the very civilization Dutch claimed to resist. When the work is done and the gang is gone, John returns to Beecher's Hope, trying once more to live as a rancher, husband, and father. But from the very beginning, the audience understands what he refuses to believe. The deal was never meant to last. At Beecher's Hope, the betrayal comes in broad daylight. Federal agents and soldiers surround the barn, box John in, and cut him down in a hail of rifle and pistol fire. No duel, no last stand against a rival outlaw, only faceless uniforms and a man in a suit giving the order. In the truest sense, this is where Rockstar's compressed history finally lines up with the real trajectory of the American West. By the 1910s, the old ways were dying for anyone who tried to live outside the law. Federal power had grown teeth. Modern bolt-action rifles, machine guns, automobiles, and coordinated rail and telegraph networks made it far harder for a high-profile outlaw to disappear between counties or play one jurisdiction against another. The world was changing from scattered sheriffs and hired detectives to a centralized state that could track, pursue, and overwhelm. Dutch's long run, evading capture for decades with a large, noisy gang, belongs more to legend. John's swift elimination by the bureaucracy feels closer to history. The agents in Red Dead Redemption are still stylized, but they are the living embodiment of a new order in the West, where RDR2 leans on the Pinkertons, echoing dime novels more than actual case files. RDR1's federal men stand in for the emerging Department of Justice, the Bureau of Investigation, and a national government increasingly willing to use coordinated violence to impose its will. They do not chase Dutch because of personal vendetta or wounded pride. They do it because the paperwork demands closure. Taken together, the two games become a story of transition, from its humble beginnings in campfire justice and county posses to a world ruled by telegraphs, files, and firing squads. The van der Linde gang is caught exactly in the middle, crushed first by its own delusions, and then by a system that no longer needs to fear the lone outlaw. Individual details may be wrong, but the emotional arc, from mythic bandits to faceless bureaucracy, lands with eerie accuracy and sets the stage for examining just how far Rockstar bends history to make that arc work. That bending begins everywhere at once. The game compresses decades of American change into a single doomed decade, arms its outlaws with weapons that are too modern and too plentiful, unleashes law enforcement that is far more coordinated than anything most real gangs ever faced, softens some of the ugliest social realities, and shrinks a continent into a few days' ride. It feels seamless. It is not. From the very beginning, Arthur Morgan is living through 40 years of history in 8. The closing of the frontier, the rise of industrial cities like Saint Denis, the last gasp of the classic outlaw era, even suffrage marches that belong closer to the 1910s are all folded into 1899. The world was changing, but not that fast. The same is true of the arsenal on Arthur's back. Semi-automatic pistols, high-capacity repeaters, scoped rifles on every hilltop. In reality, these existed, but they were rare, expensive, and hardly the standard kit of a wandering gang. Law follows the same pattern. Pinkertons in Red Dead Redemption 2 are the living embodiment of a modern surveillance state, able to track the gang into every valley and swamp. Historically, the agency spent more time breaking strikes and guarding corporate railroads than chasing one drifting band of thieves across half the country. The bounty system that magically updates across regions, the instant telegraphed response to a bar fight in Ballantyne, even the sheer frequency of armed posses, all exaggerate how tightly civilization's net really closed. Then there is the social world. Racism, sexism, and class brutality are present, but they are sanded just enough to make this story of freedom, family, loyalty, and betrayal playable for a modern audience. A black man like Charles moves through most towns with far less daily terror than many real black Americans faced in 1899. Suffragettes in St. Denis echo protests that would peak years later. The old ways were dying, but the game chooses which old cruelties to foreground and which to leave in the background. Even the land itself is an emotional map rather than a literal one. Rail lines, telegraphs, and real distances would make half of Dutch's schemes impossible to outrun. Yet the world is conveniently shrunken, so that a single camp can feel both isolated and one ride away from St. Denis, Rhodes, and the Grizzlies. From its humble beginnings in Coulter to the final descent at Beaver Hollow, the geography serves pacing, not cartography. All of this distortion has a purpose. Compressed timelines keep the narrative coherent, overpowered weapons keep the player dangerous, aggressive law keeps tension high, softened social realities keep the focus on the gang's internal fractures, and a smaller America keeps the saga moving. Rockstar is not documenting a year, it is crafting a story of loss, change, and the death of a way of life that never quite existed in this exact form, but feels, in the truest sense, emotionally real. For many players, that emotional truth is what lingers, the weight of Arthur's choices, Dutch's philosophy curdling into paranoia, John's attempt to escape the gravity of his outlaw past. Is the precise date on a protest sign or the exact model of a revolver really what matters when the final ride plays out? Or does the ache of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams turning to delusions, overpower the historian's ledger? That raises the uncomfortable question at the heart of Red Dead Redemption 2's legacy. If a game captures perfectly how the end of an era feels, does that excuse how far it bends what that era actually was? The next step is to look at where that bending crosses a line, and what is lost when emotional truth rides too far ahead of historical fact. Rockstar's answer to that tension is simple and ruthless. When emotional truth collides with the archive loses. The world was changing, but the story had to feel timeless. From the very beginning of development, a strictly accurate 1899 would have strangled the Van der Linde saga in its cradle. The classic outlaw window in the American West was already closing by the 1880s. By 1899, rail lines, telegraphs, and federal marshals meant that a gang of 20 people leaving a trail of bodies would not wander state to state for long. A smaller crew, a handful of robberies, and a swift, bureaucratic end would have been closer to reality. It would not have been an epic, it would have been a case file. Rockstar chose myth because myth gives room to breathe. A historically typical band of 3 or 4 men, scraping by on cattle theft and stagecoach jobs, could never sustain the sweeping philosophy and operatic betrayals that defined Dutch's fall. Spectacular train holdups, elaborate bank jobs in the heart of a major city, and a final stand in a mountain hideout are not just missions, they are the living embodiment of the Western dream of freedom, pushed to its breaking point. To protect that dream, the timeline had to bend. So the game cheats. It compresses 4 decades of Western imagery into one feverish decade of gameplay. Semi-automatic pistols that would have been rare curiosities sit comfortably in Arthur's holster. Suffragettes marching in St. Denis echo protests that, in reality, would crest closer to the 1910s. Industrial skylines, colonial forays in Guarma, and dusty cattle towns coexist in a single map. The result is a story of the West that is not one moment, but all moments at once. A greatest hits album of American frontier mythology. That blend also extends to the gang itself. A truly typical 1890s outlaw outfit would have been smaller, whiter, and far less interested in internal debates about freedom, loyalty, and resistance to civilization. Instead, the Van der Linde camp becomes a found family in the truest sense. A black sniper, a native tracker, a grieving widow turned avenger, a stern matriarch, conmen, drifters, and every lost soul the road can carry. Their diversity and politics mirror modern anxieties more than Gilded Age norms, but that is the point. They are built to be legible and lovable to a contemporary audience. The success of that choice speaks for itself. Millions accepted a cinematic West that feels right, even when the dates and details are wrong on paper. Does that make the game less honest, or just honest about something different? In the end, the question lingers for every historical game: is the past a puzzle to be reconstructed exactly, or a stage on which timeless human drama can play out, from its humble beginnings to its inevitable fall? So when the question shifts from dates to meaning, the van der Linde gang itself becomes the clearest answer. This is not just a band of 1899 outlaws riding out the last days of the frontier. It is a story of American history folded, warped, and squeezed into one doomed campfire circle. From the very beginning, Dutch's crew carries pieces of different centuries on their backs. In their train robberies and bank jobs, they echo Reconstruction-era and 1870s bandits, the last gasp of men who refused to accept that the railroads and telegraphs had won. In the way Pinkerton stalked them, there is the shadow of Gilded Age labor wars, when private detectives were hired less to chase lone gunmen and more to break strikes and crush unions. The game quietly takes those corporate enforcers and turns them into personal hunters, compressing an entire conflict between capital and resistance into the pursuit of one outlaw family. At the same time, the gang's language reaches forward. Dutch's speeches in Saint Denis, his talk of the people and the state, sound closer to early 20th century activists than to most men of 1899. The suffragettes protesting in the streets, the workers debating wages in the saloons, even eagle flies dreaming of organized resistance against a modern army, all pull rhetoric from decades of struggle that in reality unfolded slowly. Here, they collide in a handful of frantic years. In the truest sense, the gang becomes a funhouse mirror of the United States. Their camp is crowded with exaggerated truths and missing pieces, with long social battles compressed into tense arguments over stew and whiskey. Charles, a man of black and native heritage; Hosea, the weary conman who just wants peace; Sadie, who grows from grieving widow into relentless fighter; Javier, pulled between loyalty and survival. Each one reflects a question the country has asked itself: who gets freedom, who pays for it, and who is allowed to define civilization? Their debates over when to run, when to fight, and who deserves mercy echo arguments that played out in courtrooms, union halls, reservations, and back rooms for half a century. Their failure is not just a personal tragedy. It is the living embodiment of what happens when idealistic philosophy slams into institutions that are older, richer, and far more patient than any outlaw. By following them from hopeful camps in the mountains to the rot of Beaver Hollow, the player moves through a sped-up version of America's own journey, from frontier myth to industrial reality. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the promise that anyone could ride west and reinvent a life was being replaced by ledgers, factories, and barbed wire. So RDR2 becomes less a document of how 1899 truly was, and more a story of how it still feels to live through the end of a world that was promised and never fully delivered. And that feeling, more than any date on a calendar, is what haunts Dutch's gang long after the last shot is fired. That haunting feeling is where Red Dead Redemption 2 quietly becomes honest. Beneath every anachronistic pistol and compressed headline, the game understands one thing with painful clarity: the world was changing, and it was leaving men like Dutch and Arthur behind. From the very beginning of the story, trains thunder past snowbound camps, telegraph wires slice across empty horizons, and the glow of Saint Denis spills over the swamps like an artificial sunrise. Factories churn, smokestacks climb, and clerks with ledgers and fountain pens have more power than half the outlaws in New Hanover. The open ranges shrink under barbed wire, the small towns answer to distant banks, and informal justice gives way to warrants, judges, and faceless agencies. It is, in the truest sense, a story of freedom being audited by civilization. Historically, that pressure was real, even if RDR2 squeezes decades into a single decade. The classic frontier gunfighter era had mostly burned out by 1890, but the emotional experience of watching technology and institutions roll over an older world lasted far longer. Ranchers watched railroads cut through grazing land. Small farmers saw prices dictated by cities they would never visit. Former scouts and gunmen discovered that the telegraph and the typewriter could do more damage to their lives than any revolver. The dates might be fuzzy, yet the dread is accurate. Within the van der Linde gang, that dread becomes personal. John Marston, stumbling toward respectability, tries to trade train robberies for fence posts and cattle. His ranch is modest, his skills imperfect, but his arc mirrors thousands who bent rather than broke, who tried to find a narrow path between outlaw and employee. Dutch, by contrast, cannot bend. His philosophy demands total freedom or nothing, and every railroad built, every factory whistle, every Pinkerton telegram feels to him like a personal betrayal. One man adapts, one man refuses, and the distance between them widens with every passing train. The game's melancholy tone grows from that widening gap. RDR2 understands that no amount of violence can stop change. Every shootout only accelerates the gang's disappearance. Each dead lawman brings more lawmen. Each burned bridge invites a steel one to be built in its place. This is the living embodiment of the old ways we're dying, not in a single gunfight, but in a slow, grinding recognition that the dreams and delusions of the frontier cannot outshoot a timeable and a balance sheet. That is the paradox at the heart of RDR2. It is a deeply inaccurate chronicle that still captures what it means to live at the edge of history, to feel civilization closing in on every side while loyalty and family pull in the opposite direction. An outlaw can fight a posse, he cannot fight a census. So the question becomes not whether the gang will lose to progress, but how, and how much of themselves they will destroy on the way down. That tension points to a simple, uncomfortable truth. If Red Dead Redemption 2 were brutally accurate, it would tell a very different story of the van der Linde gang. The world was changing, but not always with shootouts in the street and grand speeches on courthouse steps. Much of that change arrived through paperwork, timetables, and men in suits no one remembered. From its humble beginnings, an accurate version of this tale would likely center on a smaller crew, closer to a handful of drifters than a roaming caravan of dozens. Dutch and Hosea might manage 3 or 4 regulars, not a mobile outlaw civilization with a full camp, a choir, and a traveling medical service. The gang's days would be filled with petty crime and quiet cons, not a new cinematic heist every chapter. More swindled cattle contracts and train ticket scams, fewer dynamite-laden locomotives plunging into ravines. Travel would change everything. Those sweeping rides from Coulter to Valentine or from Rhodes to St. Denis would become grueling. Multi-day journeys in the mud, with exhausted horses and constant delays. A single trip to rob a small-town bank could consume a week, and the real danger would not be a last-second cavalry charge of Pinkertons, but pneumonia, a lame horse, or a deputy who recognized a face from a wanted poster mailed months earlier. Survival would be harsher and quieter in the truest sense. Starvation, infection, and exposure would claim more outlaws than bullets. Arthur's tuberculosis would not be a rare, tragic twist. It would be the living embodiment of a continent where disease traveled faster than justice. Most characters would not die in operatic last stands under stormy skies. They would fade in back rooms, vanish in county jails, or disappear into cheap labor on distant rail lines, their loyalty repaid with indifference. Such a game might delight historians. It would honor the slow grind of law, the reach of the telegraph, the way the old ways were dying under ledgers and land deeds. But would it still feel like the saga of Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and John? Or would that mythology, that sense of doomed grandeur, evaporate the moment the gang became just another footnote in a census report? Player expectations push the story toward myth. An open world invites power, impact, and clear narrative arcs, a rise, a fall, a final reckoning, a camp that never attempts a St. Denis bank robbery, a leader who slips away quietly instead of orchestrating betrayals, a lost soul who does not get a chance at redemption on a mountaintop. Those might be realistic, but they rarely satisfy the hunger for meaning. Some smaller, niche titles choose the harsher road. They simulate long rides, empty landscapes, and endings that barely feel like endings at all. Yet they almost never shape culture the way Rockstar's stylized operas do. So the question lingers over every gunfight and campfire: where should the line be drawn, and how much inaccuracy is worth a story that hits as hard as Arthur Morgan's? So the line has been drawn, at least in theory, but this is where the story turns back on the player, because every campfire tale about accuracy hides a quiet question. Which moment felt so authentic, so grounded in history, that it never seemed worth doubting? For some, it will always be the Pinkertons. The stern men in bowler hats and dust-coated suits, the living embodiment of law closing in on a dying frontier, appear to be the natural predators of an outlaw family. It feels right that they stalk Dutch from the snowy mountains to the swamps, as relentless as the telegraph wires stretching across the land. Yet in the truest sense, the real agency spent far more time crushing unions and guarding company railroads than chasing one charismatic bandit through the wilderness. Others will remember St. Denis. From its humble beginnings as a foggy silhouette across the water to the blinding electric lights of its streets, it seems to stand as a story of progress made brick and steel. The protests, the speeches, the suffragettes with their banners and placards give the impression of a world waking up all at once. But those scenes quietly compress a decade of struggle into a single summer, borrowing the heat of 1910's activism to ignite an 1899 city that was still learning how to breathe modern air. There are smaller moments, too, details that feel almost invisible. A favorite revolver that should have been a rare curiosity rather than a common sidearm. A scoped rifle that turns every hillside into a sniper's nest, even though such weapons were scarce and awkward in the real 1890s. A town that looks like a rough frontier outpost, even as railroads, telegraphs, and federal marshals had already sewn most of the continent into a tighter web of civilization than the game admits. Which of those details slipped past unquestioned? This is the turning point. The question is no longer whether Rockstar bent the record, but how those bends reshape the emotional weight of each scene. Does learning that the Pinkertons were more interested in breaking strikes than hunting Dutch change the way their threats sound on that riverboat? Does realizing that St. Denis' protests belong to a later decade soften or sharpen the tragedy of a world that claims to be moving forward while leaving so many lost soul figures behind? The conversation does not end here. The most surprising reflections, the sharpest examples of that felt real, but it wasn't, can become part of an ongoing dialogue, echoed in future videos and quiet community posts. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, does not belong solely to one script. It belongs to every player who starts to wonder what other realistic games are quietly rewriting history for drama, and what that says about the world those games are teaching the audience to remember. If Red Dead Redemption 2 is quietly rewriting 1899, then the next question is unavoidable. Where does this story of America's outlaw imagination go next? Because the world was changing long before Arthur Morgan ever rode into Valentine, and the decades around him are filled with eras even more unstable, even more uncomfortable, than the one Rockstar has already blurred. The first obvious frontier is the Civil War itself. From its humble beginnings, a Red Dead set between blue and gray uniforms almost writes itself. Guerrilla raids in Missouri, burned towns in Kansas, Confederate bushwhackers who already feel like Vanderlinde gang members. It would be a story of freedom and slavery, of loyalty and betrayal, of families torn apart not by a bank robbery gone wrong, but by conscription, desertion, and occupation. Yet that same setting forces a harder question. How far can a cinematic outlaw fantasy go when slavery is not background flavor, but the central economic engine of the world on screen? Just as potent is the brutal aftermath. A Reconstruction-era Red Dead in the 1870s or 1880s would trade battlefields for shattered towns and half-rebuilt courthouses. The old ways were dying, but not cleanly. Night riders and racial terror, railroads carved through stolen land, Pinkertons hired not to chase train robbers, but to crush striking workers and protect corporate interests. In the truest sense, this is where Dutch's philosophy about civilization being corrupt actually comes from. Imagine a gang caught between black freedmen trying to claim land, former Confederates trying to reclaim power, and industrial bosses treating everyone as expendable. How honest should a game be about that kind of hatred and exploitation? Or the series could leap forward instead, into the early 1920s, where bootleggers and gangsters replace cowboys and rustlers. Prohibition, speakeasies, Thompson submachine guns in the alleys of a St. Denis that has fully become the living embodiment of the modern American city. The frontier is gone, but the outlaw impulse survives in tailored suits and smugglers' boats. Corrupt police, backroom deals, and organized crime offer a new stage for the same dreams and delusions. Would a player rather stalk oil barons in the swamps, or run liquor past federal agents on moonlit rivers? Each era brings its own collision between myth and memory, between what audiences expect from an outlaw story and what the record actually shows. Some will want Rockstar to lean harder into harsh realism next time, to confront slavery, racial terror, and industrial cruelty head-on, even if that makes the game heavier and less escapist. Others will prefer the emotionally driven, mythic tone of Red Dead Redemption 2, where history is a backdrop for intimate tragedy rather than a strict syllabus. That tension does not have to be settled in one script. A pinned comment or a community poll can turn this into an ongoing conversation. Civil War, Reconstruction, or Roaring Twenties, and how much accuracy versus drama should define each. Because from the very beginning, this series has been about how civilization tells stories about its own sins. The real question is what happens when the next Red Dead stops hinting at those sins and finally drags them into the light. So the circle closes where it began, with a legend that feels true, wrapped around a history that never quite was. From its humble beginnings in that impossible meet-cute between Dutch and Hosea in the 1870s, two men trying to rob each other and somehow founding a philosophy of freedom and family, the game has always announced itself as a story of contradictions, of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions held together by sheer conviction. Tracing their path through this world reveals how far the fiction stretches. Dutch and Hosea's partnership belongs to an earlier outlaw age, yet the gang rides through an 1899 crowded with semi-automatic pistols, lever rifles, scoped repeaters, and a bounty system that behaves more like a modern police database than a frontier ledger. The Pinkertons thunder across states in theatrical pursuit, the living embodiment of a centralized surveillance state that, in reality, was far more concerned with labor strikes and corporate railroads than with one fading band of thieves in the woods. Around them, the map itself shrinks and bends. Saint Denis wears the electric glow and streetcars of New Orleans. Valentine borrows from half a dozen cattle towns, and the distances between bayou, snowfield, and desert collapse into a single hard ride. In the truest sense, the world was changing, but not this quickly and not this neatly. The game compresses the sprawl of the American West into something a gang can cross in an afternoon, turning weeks of mud, dust, and exhaustion into a cinematic transition. The same compression happens in time. Frontier gunfighter myths from the 1870s, Gilded Age corporate power, 1890s rail networks, and even 1910s suffrage marches all bleed into the same 8-year window. The result is that Arthur Morgan and the Van der Linde gang live through roughly 40 years of American change in a single doomed sprint. A tragic, impossible family staggering under a history that never unfolded in that order. Is it accurate? No. Is it revealing? Absolutely. Because once those seams are visible, the game's intent becomes clearer. Red Dead Redemption 2 is not a textbook. It is a Western myth told with modern sensibilities. A story of the old ways were dying crafted by a 21st century conscience. Its softened race and gender politics, its more inclusive camp, its carefully chosen horrors and silences, all say more about contemporary civilization than about 1899 America. Yet the emotional truth remains. Loss, loyalty, and betrayal still cut deep, even when the dates are wrong and the guns are generous. Part of engaging with historical fiction is learning to hold both realities at once, the facts that never were, and the feelings that absolutely are. So the question becomes, where else does this happen? In games, films, and shows that swear they are realistic. What other legends are beautiful, powerful, and wrong at the same time, waiting to be pulled apart in the next chapter of this examination of the West and its ghosts? That is where the ghosts linger, in the gap between what happened and what feels true. The examination of Red Dead Redemption 2 becomes, in the truest sense, a story of two Wests at once, and anyone still riding with it now has proven willing to sit through the whole saga and stare both of them in the eye. So this is the moment to turn that patience into action. If this long ride through myths, mistakes, and deliberate distortions has been worth the journey, let the signal carry further. A simple like, a quiet subscription, a share to that one friend who still swears RDR2 is perfectly accurate turns this from a solitary watch into a friendly challenge. Not a takedown. A duel of interpretations, where the goal is not humiliation, but clarity. Because this was never only about one outlaw gang or one game. It was about how an entire world of interactive stories keeps bending history to serve emotion, pacing, and spectacle. In Assassin's Creed, Renaissance assassins parkour through centuries of compressed philosophy and politics. In Mafia, prohibition and post-war America are distilled into a handful of neighborhoods and a few bloody betrayals. In Battlefield, whole fronts of industrialized war become focused vignettes of individual courage and catastrophe. Which of those liberties land, and which break the spell completely? The comments become the campfire for that debate. One invitation stands from the very beginning. Name a moment in Red Dead Redemption 2 that once felt realistic and now looks different. Perhaps the Pinkertons hounding Dutch across half a continent, or semi-automatic pistols so common they might as well grow from the mud. Pair it with a second memory, a detail that is wildly inaccurate, yet made the story hit harder. A too modern suffrage protest in Saint Denis that sharpened the sense that the world was changing. A gunfight that could never have unfolded that way, but etched the cost of freedom and civilization into the player's mind. From its humble beginnings as a tale of one gang, this can widen into a larger reckoning. There are deeper dives wading into Pinkertons and private detectives, into how suffrage and race are folded into this imagined 1899, into the weapons that belong to the 1870s and the 1910s, yet somehow share the same saddlebag. There are future journeys through other historical games, tracing where their dreams and delusions collide with the archive. In the end, the van der Linde saga is not diminished by its inaccuracies. It is the living embodiment of a larger pattern, legends bending facts, and facts reshaping legends in return. Stories of freedom, family, loyalty, and betrayal gain power when the myth and the record are held side by side, not when one erases the other. To ride with these characters, to love them, and still question the myths they rest on is not a betrayal. It is a final act of respect for both history and the story that dared to rewrite it. So the trail does not end here. It simply turns, inviting the next writer to follow, to question, and to keep the legend honest.